Hello everybody, and welcome to a special episode of The Night of the Rabbits. I said I was gonna do it, and I plan to. So we're gonna go through and listen to all the audiobooks. This is just audiobooks, the extra stuff. So if you don't want to listen along, you don't have to. I hope you do enjoy though. And good luck.
The first story of mice, squirrels, and Mousewood Forest. Somewhere, tucked away between faraway fields and winding paths, there lies a forest crowded with mice and squirrels. So crowded, in fact, that even a mighty wizard with an even mightier beard couldn't wander the forest's paths without being asked by some tiny rodents for a lift, because they wanted to visit relatives who moved 3 clearings down the road a few years ago because there were gooseberries over there. And because there are so many mice, the forest is known as Mousewood Forest. But something was going on in the otherwise tranquil Mousewood Forest. A forest so peaceful that at noon all you would sense was the soft rustle of the wind in the treetops, the sweet scent of the pine needles, and a lone buzzing bee skipping its lunch break. Yes, something in this tranquil forest was disturbing the peace. For a few days now, some furry, fairly unhappy red squirrels had refused to refer to the forest as Mousewood Forest. The squirrels, as they saw it, were narrowly outnumbered by the grey mice. Why, they wondered, should Mousewood Forest only be known as Mousewood Forest? So they made a great effort to remind visitors out for a Sunday walk or a picnic that there were not only small grey mice, but also auburn squirrels with bushy tails and equally bushy ears. For example, under each sign that read Mousewood Forest, they attached a second, reading, "and Squirrelwood." Furthermore, a few squirrels with particularly fluffy red fur lay in wait behind tree stumps and hidden in foliage to jump out in front of passers-by, look at those humans with honest, beady eyes, and push the idea that this forest could just as well be called Squirrelwood. As a rule, most humans are startled when suddenly something pops out in front of them from behind something. This may lead to them no longer thinking about Mousewood Forest and its name, which could just as well be a different name. Instead, they may flee, never to return. Or they may even scream and shout, since they weren't expecting to be startled. Those who run away never to return, the squirrels reckoned, would probably call fair Mousewood Forest by its name, which might just as well be a different name. A startled, fleeing rambler might even call Mousewood Forest "Don't go there." And that, the squirrels concluded, would be even less desirable than Mousewood Forest. If people started screaming when startled by a small auburn animal, the serenity of the forest would be lost for good. And neither the squirrels nor the countless other forest dwellers, not even the inhabitants of Mousewood, Mousewood Forest's capital, would want that. For serenity in a forest is no ordinary silence, like in a boring, noiseless room, but a cacophony of many tiny, likeable sounds. The wind wafting through the leaves, twigs clicking in the canopy, rustling down in the undergrowth, and the gentle creaking of towering trunks. So, if the squirrels wanted to purposely pop out from behind something, they had to be careful about doing it, without scaring anybody off or disturbing the forest's serenity. Those who know squirrels are probably wondering how anyone could possibly be afraid of the little fellows at all. Well, if a small animal with a bushy red tail suddenly crossed your path, you might be briefly startled, but in an instant you'd spot that the little animal was just as much taken by surprise as yourself. What would follow is a cautious glance and then a quick dash to safety. Then again, if a small animal with a bushy red tail and beady eyes leapt out in front of you when you're roaming the woods, and you happened to notice, after a fleeting moment of fright, that this squirrel was actually up to something, that it was standing in the way of somebody so much taller than itself on purpose, then such a small animal must surely be capable of anything. It'd probably run up to you really fast, climb up your legs and back until it reached the top of your head, and then start furiously tousling your hair with its tiny paws. In anticipation of this, anybody would run or scream, assuming they don't actually like getting their hair tousled by squirrels who are up to something. Since squirrels are generally not very fond of having their own fur tousled, they try and hide the fact that they leap out on purpose. It has to look like a coincidence. Even those blessed with beady eyes have to play act a bit if they want to appear surprised and shy when they in fact aren't. Just this morning, around 9 o'clock, 3 squirrels decided to practice popping out from behind something, since, as you now know, it's easier said than done. Wait for it. Wait for it. Leap. Stop. Have a look round. Spot the rambler. Freeze. Stare at the rambler and straighten those tufted ears. Add a few skillful hops behind the next bush, spiral up that tree like an expert, and then watch the rambler's reaction from a safe distance. As if you really were surprised to see me. Well done, Oswald, said Edgar, one of the 3 squirrels. He had played the role of the rambler, roaming around before then getting a reminder of the striking number of squirrels living in these woods. He had held a large leaf painted with a surprised human face in front of him to make this training exercise as real as possible. Oswald, the 2nd squirrel, climbed nimbly down the tree, while Edward, the 3rd squirrel, who had only played the role of spectator during this run, hopped out of the nearby bushes. Yeah, really good, he confirmed. Flawless, even. Looked really realistic to me. Thanks, Oswald said. It was time to switch roles. Since Oswald already knew the ropes of popping out from behind something, it was his turn to watch from the bushes. He was in an excellent position to tell Edgar, who had just played the rambler, if he was also good at popping out from behind something, or if there was anything he could improve on. Edward just had to stroll along the path and carry the leaf with a face on it in front of him. When Edgar popped out by chance and confronted Edward, the latter froze as if petrified. The leaf in his paws began to shake, as did his legs and eventually his squirrely tail. He seemed truly shaken. Shaken like a rambler afraid of a squirrel tousling his hair. Faced with this, Edgar completely forgot that he had to act like a shy squirrel and was supposed to scurry up the next tree. Instead, he just stared, stock still, at the face painted on the shaking leaf. Edward took his role of a startled visitor very seriously. As soon as he noticed that the animal with the red bushy tail and beady eyes that had suddenly popped out in front of him wasn't in the least bit shy or frightened, he shook even more. "Ah!" he yelled, certain that this was how somebody afraid their hair was about to be tousled would yell. He turned and ran away as fast as he could. And because he was determined to be as convincing as possible, he disappeared for a few days. After waiting for a couple of hours, Edgar and Oswald were no longer in the mood to continue their training. They sat down by a small stream running through the forest and thought. They thought about training, and about the fact that thinking about training was already a good training exercise in itself, sometimes. And then they thought about acorns and nuts. After a while, a group of mice came along the bank of the stream. "Hello there, a very good day to you." "How are you?" Edgar responded. "Good day to you too," said Oswald. One of the mice stepped forward and took a small leaf with writing on it from his rucksack. After clearing his throat, the mouse began to read aloud. "Dear Squirrels, we, the mice, know you don't really like the name Mousewood Forest. Since your kind is so numerous in this forest, it might just as well be named after you. Since noticing how much effort you put into reminding people that the forest could be named differently, we wanted to invite you to a meeting where we will consider, together with the other forest dwellers, what to do about the situation." The mouse rolled up the leaf and put it back in his rucksack. Oswald and Edgar thought briefly about what the mouse had just read to them. They concluded that if they didn't have to remind people that Squirrelwood would also be a fitting name for their forest, there would be plenty of time for all sorts of other things. And Edward would surely say there was no fun in hiding for ages just to play a scared rambler convincingly in order to practice popping out from behind something. If, that is, he weren't hiding right now. So they accepted the mice's invitation and followed them along the stream until they reached a clearing where many other forest dwellers were already gathered. Mice, squirrels, hedgehogs, dwarves, hares and bears, and many more inhabitants of the forest were sitting on benches made from long branches or standing next to tables set with freshly baked blueberry pie. They were chatting about this and that and other things. One young badger was talking to a hedgehog about fishing at the pond. A beaver was discussing the quality of lumber with the hedgehog brothers. Two little mice were playing tag with the rabbit kids, while their mothers tried to persuade a grumpy wood dwarf to reveal the recipe for a drink made with dwarf root. On a stump sat Conrad, the great owl. He was a member of the town council, and his great owl eyes looked benevolently upon the crowd of animals, dwarves, and whoever else had gathered there. "Hoot!" he called out with a deep and calm voice, instantly gaining the audience's attention. "My dear friends," he began, "as you may be aware, we have gathered here to resolve the dispute about the name of our forest. I am honoured to hold the chair of this assembly. Many of the squirrels among us would like to see Squirrelwood as the legitimate name for our home. Well, seeing as there are a good deal of squirrels here in our forest, their wish is hardly surprising. But let us not dwell on that." He slowly closed his eyes, only to open them again in an instant, as if he had had a sudden stroke of genius. "A forest called Mousewood Forest. What kind of forest would come to someone's mind who was, not familiar with our beloved woods?" Conrad's head turned inquisitively as his gaze wandered across the gathering. Animals, dwarves, and a few others thought hard. Oswald the squirrel's first thoughts were concerned with nuts, but he quickly realized that these had nothing to do with the name, more the fact that he really liked nuts. So he continued thinking hard and eventually called out in a low voice, "They'd probably think of a wood full of mice?" Conrad the old owl blinked with his left eye, with his right following shortly after. "This is indeed what someone would think when they first heard the name. Thank you, Oswald," said the owl. "But there are not only mice in these woods. There is, in fact, no such thing as a forest populated solely by mice. What sort of forest would that be if there were only mice in it?" Much murmuring ran through the assembled ranks. Even the mice had trouble imagining a forest with only mice in. Nothing but mice. "We mice can't do everything on our own," said a young mouse named Humbert, while the older mice nodded in agreement. "All on our own? Impossible," they exclaimed. "You see," said the owl calmly, "and we can't survive without you either." This he said with such conviction that some of the mice flinched. They had good reason to assume that this owl had an occasional appetite for mice, despite his wisdom and kindness. "So, if someone hears the name Mousewood Forest and thinks there will only be mice, they will quickly come to the conclusion that such a thing cannot exist." Conrad balanced carefully on the stump as he spoke. "They will be aware that there must be squirrels and badgers and ants and crows and all kinds of other animals. We all need each other to survive." "But why is Mousewood Forest called Mousewood Forest anyway?" some squirrels wanted to know, still feeling disadvantaged. A wood sprite nervously clicked some twigs. "Because, at the time this forest was named, there were a lot of mice here, as there still are today. But even if one day there are fewer mice, this forest will still be called Mousewood Forest. You can't just rename a forest, can you? Just imagine if someone wanted to visit and couldn't find us because the forest had been renamed. Hoot! And the squirrels had to agree. They had grandparents who rarely visited since they lived so far away. They didn't dare think how sad it would be if they were unable to visit because they couldn't find Mousewood Forest anymore. Furthermore, Conrad continued, it would not be wise to add squirrels to the forest's name, for then we would have to add the dwarves and all the other animals as well. A name is not supposed to be a census. Oot! Just imagine the confusion that would result. The squirrels preferred to think about nuts and acorns. They were far less confusing. You see, Conrad concluded, it is not about how many of a certain kind are present, or who was here first. This forest belongs to each and every animal living in and near it. Oot! Even if it is called Mousewood Forest, no one would ever believe only mice live here. It is a name, and the point of a name is to paint part of the whole picture, perhaps part of its history. Conrad then realized that most of the animals didn't understand, so he tried to give them an example. You see, someone called Honesty does not necessarily have to be honest. If she is dishonest, she would surely not change her name. Hoot! She would remain Honesty, since that is the name that was given her. The little mouse called Humbert yelled in outrage, but if she were honest, she would return her name. If she were honest, said a surly wood dwarf to Humbert, she wouldn't have to, then she could keep her name. Conrad the owl closed both eyes, before he said slowly, but with empathy and a touch of impatience, you do not change a name. You rarely do. Usually you don't. That would have to suffice. He spread his wings, performed 2 quick hops on the stump, and then, with 2 or 3 silent flaps, soared skywards. Some animals were satisfied with his explanation. Others debated whether Honesty could keep her name if she at least volunteered to return it after a single dishonesty, since that would be the honest thing to do. Others swiftly made their way home, unsettled by the huge owl circling overhead. The squirrels, Oswald and Edgar, were now looking for Edward. He had managed to hide in exactly the way someone afraid a small animal with a bushy red tail and beady black eyes would leap on his head and furiously tousle everything up there would. They walked slowly along the stream. The hubbub faded with each step they took away from the clearing and eventually died away. Wind rustled the treetops, and Oswald paused, pondering. So, the wood is not very much like its name, but it doesn't need to be, since names don't change. It just is. Even though the forest is constantly changing and growing, it just takes its name along with it. Edgar nodded eagerly. Both were glad that, since the forest could not just be renamed Squirrelwood, they and their well-hidden friend would have the next day off. Because somebody, at some point, when the forest was much smaller, had given it its name. And you don't change names. Well, rarely. Usually, you don't. Second story. A wizard at the post office. One morning, a really old wizard living on the outskirts of Mousewood decided to pay a visit to the post office. The wizard was very wise and knowledgeable, but he rarely talked to his neighbours, like the Hedgehog brothers who resided a few steps further towards Mousewood town centre, or the Toad family of Meadow Pond. He was leaning on his bedroom windowsill, enjoying the refreshing view of green meadows, when through the foggy morning dew, which sparkled in the early sunlight, he noticed 2 familiar figures trundling along the track nearby. One didn't need magical powers to spot that these were the Hedgehog brothers on their way to the river, even though at that time of day they were usually headed in the opposite direction to the edge of the forest, where they could get all kinds of building materials. One would, however, need magical powers to know that these 2 were on their way to the post office to pick up a delivery. They had ordered new tools for their carpentry business. The wizard felt that he, too, should pay the post office a visit. He had a magical hunch, as skilled wizards like himself tend to have from time to time. He sensed that he had to go to the post office to receive a letter. What he didn't know, though, was if the postman was ill or had simply forgotten his post. Magical hunches tend not to be all that accurate, so a lot of wizards don't really pay attention to them when they come to mind. But our wizard didn't really have anything else to do. He took a deep breath and then slowly exhaled. Then he closed the window and grabbed his case, a wooden case with shoulder straps made of leather. He always had the case with him, as a wizard has to expect to be asked for help, and should thus have a few helpful things at hand. The wizard hurried down the stairs, packed a bit of this and a bit of that, then unlatched his massive wooden front door and stepped outside. High above him, the wind rustled the green crown of the beech tree, the very same beech he had stood beneath many years before when he decided to build his home here. Back then, his beard had already been white, though shorter and scraggier. The Hedgehog brothers' father had run a carpentry business and supervised the construction of the wizard's house. Just like his sons, he was a master of his craft. The wizard turned and walked along the path from his house to the wider track that ran beside the fields. The sun was busy spreading its warmth across the path, driving the moisture from the dark sand, slowly turning the rich, humid brown to a lighter, dry tone. The scrubby weeds at the roadside were still heavy with dew, which bent them towards the ground where they sleepily rested on each other. Some of them sprang up as if startled from sleep as soon as the old man, who knew many, but not, of course, all the secrets of magic, brushed them with his feet. The wizard hitched the strap of his case over his right shoulder, clutched it close to his body with his left hand, and began walking faster. The sound of the sand under his feet and the wide fields blending into the horizon lit a spark in the wizard's eyes. The choice of paths and destinations a rambler had here, and the unconditional beauty of the landscape, reminded him of the freedom he had to roam wherever he wished, while still having the possibility to return home. Having this meant having almost everything one could wish for. With almost everything in his luggage necessary for a happy life, the old man walked on and on. In the distance he could see people working in the fields. This view was unusual for him, as he lived on the outskirts of Mousewood, where humans were rare visitors. For the people, the wizard pondered, it would be the other way round. They would be surprised if they saw animals at work. If, for example, a badger crossed their path carrying paintbrush and easel and politely greeted them, the most courteous response he could hope for would be something along the lines of, "Look, a badger! They live in the woods and eat beetles, I think." The other humans would simply nod and return to their human business. Why that is, most animals can only guess. Perhaps humans have poor eyesight. Perhaps they're a bit dim-witted or eat overripe mushrooms. And those can have strange side effects, as animals know. Or maybe they can't take something that's smaller than them seriously. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Most humans just seem to have forgotten how to live among animals. Those farmhands would even have been bewildered at the sight of a wizard at the post office, especially seeing that the post office was run by a beaver. A few steps further on, the old man came to a house made of coarse stones, effortlessly holding up a thick thatched roof. He noticed a mother rabbit hanging out her laundry in the front yard. A baby rabbit sat beside her on a stump, watching her with curiosity. Each time she took a fresh piece of laundry from her basket, the boy looked closely, eager to know if it was a shirt or socks or something completely different. As she pulled it out and hung it over the clothes line, he jumped up and ran right under the piece of laundry so he could see exactly how she hung it on the line. Then he looked at her again to see what she'd do next. And as she reached into the basket, he sat down again on the stump, no less excited than before and eager to see the next piece of clothing to be hung up. Even though the wizard wasn't the chattiest person in the forest, He did talk to the mother rabbit now and then about this and that when they met on the path or elsewhere. And since she was no longer the youngest rabbit, and he was definitely old, they had been neighbours long enough to fit in a lot of now and thens, and so knew each other pretty well. "Hello, Mrs. Rabbit," said the wizard, and was quite startled by the sound of his own voice, since he'd been lost in thought for days, talking to no one but himself. The little rabbit turned to the wizard, and her big rabbit eyes took in the old man. For a second he gazed back from under his white bushy brows in similar bewilderment. "Why, hello, where are you heading?" she asked, a pile of towels under her arm. "I'm on the way to the post office," he replied. "So you're expecting something?" the rabbit lady said, as she sorted socks by colour. "Indeed, a letter. It's just a magical hunch, but it won't hurt to pay the beaver a visit, will it? At least the fresh air will do me some good." "That's for sure," replied the rabbit, and with 2 quick waves of her hand, turned a duvet cover inside out, and with 2 more skilled twists, threw it over the last free section of clothesline. Then she picked up 2 clothes pegs and handed them to the boy. With a resolute look, he took the pegs, got up on the stump he'd been sitting on, and stretched out his arms in front of him. His mother lifted him up to reach the clothesline and peg the cover to the line. He folded his arms and inspected his work. His mother sat him down in this position and turned back to the wizard. "My son Tim has no school today, and I have so much to do he's bound to get bored. Would you mind taking him with you to the post office?" The old man would have been grateful for the opportunity to think about this request for a while and decide if it was a good idea. As he lowered his head to think about it for at least a moment, his gaze met those big rabbit eyes again. Tim was all set and even had his rucksack ready, which caused the wizard to murmur in astonishment, which otherwise happened only rarely. The wise old man and his young companion set off, accompanied by a fresh midday breeze. The young rabbit had no difficulty keeping up with the pace of the, at least compared to a rabbit, giant wizard, but the man walked a tad slower than usual anyway. They walked on for a while, and then walked on for another while, in silence, past whispering meadows. A couple of steps away from the path, a gnarled tree creaked, and along with 2 scrubby bushes growing comfortably by its knotty trunk, couldn't help but notice the wizard's intense silence. The man, trained in the arts of magic, wasn't sure if it would be better to stay silent or actually say something, and even if he'd been sure it would be better to say something, he would still have struggled to come up with something to say. As he pondered this problem, he missed a gnarled root sticking out of the ground in front of him. He staggered, flailed around in surprise, and seemed about to tumble. But eventually he regained his balance and steadied himself. Taking a deep breath and smoothing down his beard, he noticed Tim peering at him. The old man looked down, unable to spot any harm or injury. "I'm all right," said the wizard. "Let's be on our way." "Onward ho!" said Tim, and started walking at a slower pace than young rabbits usually do, even though the wizard hadn't hurt himself. So they left the root behind, along with the gnarled tree that didn't seem to be in the slightest involved in this episode. On their way, the 2 of them met a hedgehog who was spreading out a red and white checked blanket on the grass by the bridge across the gushing stream that had to be crossed on the way to the post office. He seemed to be just settling down for a lunch break and was taking some sandwiches out of a basket beside him. As he noticed the 2 hikers, he stopped what he was doing, stood up, and with a broad, happy smile, asked with blinking hedgehog eyes, "Where are you 2 heading?" "To the stream," the old man replied. "My young friend and I are on our way to the post office." Tim and the wizard stood by the wayside, both of them realizing that it was about lunchtime. This obviously didn't escape the hedgehog, and he decided a tasty sandwich would do the 2 of them good. Fresh country air provides a healthy appetite, and if there was one thing there was no shortage of out here, it was country air. "May I offer you a little refreshment?" asked the hedgehog, who loved to pack a little something more than he could actually eat, as he also loved to share. Tim looked inquisitively at the wizard as the old man answered, "Well, thank you. We very much appreciate the offer." Tim continued to look up at him inquisitively. With a slight creaking sound, the wizard bent down to the young rabbit. He explained that you shouldn't usually accept things from strangers if you're not a wizard. Wizards always know if they're dealing with a scoundrel or simply a friendly stranger. Tim nodded in agreement. The hedgehog pretended to overhear the fact he was being merely deemed a stranger who happened to be friendly. He was a modest fellow, so he didn't dwell on it, and instead handed his guests his most delicious sandwiches, which was difficult because when it came to sandwiches, he was a master of his craft, so they were all truly delicious. The three of them sat beside the stream, enjoying their lunch, and talked. The hedgehog introduced himself as Heinz. He was a cousin of the Hedgehog brothers, who were, as Heinz explained, also on their way to the post office. The wizard recalled seeing them in the morning as he looked out of his window. The hedgehogs were planning to pick up their cousin here at the stream on their way back. After all, they knew he enjoyed sitting in the sun, listening to the stream's unhurried murmuring. And Heinz knew they wouldn't take a break, even for tasty sandwiches like these, if they were picking up new tools. So he decided to wait for them right there. Tim ventured to the bank and had a look round. "Look at this," he called out. Both cautiously made their way through the tall grass along the water's edge. The stream was full of tiny fish, struggling against the smooth current. The three of them watched the opalescent fish and the crystal clear water for a while. Around them, beetles buzzed through the air, enjoying the sunshine and the gentle breeze. It seemed to be cooler in the shade down under the bridge, where a gurgling ripple could be heard. From the opposite side of the stream, Heinz waved goodbye as Tim and the wizard crossed the bridge. Tim waved back and kept looking back until he could no longer see the hedgehog because of the tall grass. Tim now walked a few paces ahead, but stopped to listen when their feet took them into a part of the forest where the ground was covered in a thick layer of pine needles. Even a fully fledged wizard can't match the listening skills of a young rabbit. The wise man listened, but the forest was so silent he could hear nothing but his own heartbeat. The rabbit's ears, however, were so keen that he could clearly hear two voices singing merrily further along the path. Shortly afterwards, the wizard also became aware of two hedgehogs approaching. It was the Hedgehog brothers, on their way back after successfully picking up their new tools from the post office. "A brand new hammer is a wonderful thing. Our old one has long lost its swing. A new saw helps us build your home. The old one, well, just made us groan. New tools were sent us through the post. For carpentry's what we like most." The Hedgehog brothers continued the song by rhythmically imitating various tools. But when they noticed two people in the forest crossing their path, they stopped. They probably preferred to sing without an audience. After recognizing two familiar faces, they raised their hats as they approached. "Good day to you, Master Wizard," they greeted in unison. The wizard gave them a friendly wave, and Tim nodded politely. "Looks like you've got everything you ordered," said the wizard. "Absolutely right," one hedgehog brother replied happily. He could easily be told apart from his brother, as he was wearing blue dungarees. "But we've got to be on our way now. Our cousin's waiting for us in the meadows near the stream. I hope the wait isn't too boring for him. He's got no tools, you know," said his brother in the red dungarees. "Not to worry," the wizard replied. "Not to worry," Tim added. And so the Hedgehog brothers walked on towards Mousewood, while the young rabbit and his aged companion followed the stream to the post office, which stood on the bank among some old willow trees. "Here we are, the post office," said the wizard in a portentous voice. Tim was very impressed. On the side of the building facing the river, a water wheel rustled and clattered. A rustic pier led to a boat, waiting to stem itself against the stream or gently glide through the water to other forests, towns, and post offices, maybe even as far as the sea. As they entered, they were greeted by the postmaster, a stout beaver who was sorting letters at his desk. Beside him stood piles of carefully wrapped parcels. "Hello there, Mr. Beaver. Do you have any post for me?" the wizard asked politely. "No, I'm sorry. I'd know if I did," the beaver said, adding, "Besides, you should know we deliver directly to you." "Well, that is if something's been left here, but—" and he gestured towards some pigeonholes reserved for the wizard's district of Mousewood. "Nothing has." "That's okay," the wise old man replied, pondering. "That's the thing with magical hunches. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't." Nevertheless, he still had the uncanny feeling there was post waiting for him. He didn't think it wise to mention this at the post office, though. If the beaver told him there was no post, there was no post. As the wizard continued to ponder, accompanied by the water wheel's helpful rattling, the stout postmaster told Tim of the time when Mousewood almost underwent a name change, a matter that had caused him many a sleepless night. You can't just change a forest's name. It's especially harrowing for a postman. Tim agreed. As noon turned to afternoon and the sun's rays took on a warm golden yellow, the little rabbit and the wizard, still pondering, made their way home. As they walked beneath regal pines, the old man looked up and let his gaze rest upon an exhilarating symphony of light and shadow. High above them, spiders' webs shimmered between the branches. Old, abandoned, and riddled with holes, their creators had long since left on 8 busy legs. "Just look at that," the wizard said, and pointed upwards. Tim was delighted by the spectacle high overhead, and found out after a while that, if he spun around on the spot while looking up at the webs, the sunlight caught in them refracted into opalescent colours. With a harumph, the wizard looked down at him. "I don't suppose your mother would be too happy if I told her you were spinning around like that." Tim looked at the wizard, who blocked out the sun and treetops like an old cloud. Then the wizard shook with laughter and started spinning himself. Then Tim began to laugh. A family of mice, who had just curled up with their evening tea, listened to the disturbance in their otherwise quiet neighbourhood. But while their kids acted as if they'd be held responsible for all the noise, eventually the mouse father couldn't hold back any longer and joined in. Along with his wife and the mice's grandmother, they rocked with laughter. Tim and the wizard arrived back at the bridge, passing the meadow where they had met Heinz. Both walked a little slower as they remembered the kind hedgehog as well as the shiny fish they had watched in the stream. Further along the path, Tim noticed a familiar root. He politely asked the wizard to stand back. Then he hopped from where he stood, as rabbits tend to do, right over the root without difficulty. He glanced back and assured his companion that this method of passing the root was completely safe. The wizard gave a stern look at the snare that had caused him to stumble that afternoon. Then he performed a lively and, for such an old wizard, impressive hop right over it. As he landed, the wizard glanced down at the root. It stuck out of the ground as innocently as a root can. The gnarled tree nearby would probably have enjoyed the spectacle, but right now it seemed to be taking a nap. The wizard snapped his fingers, and the air filled with glistening, crackling sparks. With a rustle, the root disappeared into the earth of the forest. After this magical sleight of hand, the old man rejoined his companion, and together they continued on their way, just like two ramblers who know at least 2 safe methods to get past roots crossing your path. After a while they reached the house where the wizard had met the little rabbit and his mother that morning. The laundry waved in the gentle evening breeze. "I'm home," Tim shouted, and a few moments later the door opened and 5 curious rabbit heads poked out. Mrs. Rabbit made her way through Tim's siblings, drying her hands on a tea towel. She laughingly embraced the little rabbit as he leapt up at her. On the doorstep, the family bade the wizard farewell, and none of the little rabbits let him leave without a hearty goodbye. The wizard bowed and wished them a good evening. "Many thanks for your company on the way to the post office, my young friend," the old man said to Tim, who waved one last farewell. Then Mrs. Rabbit and her children went into the house. Leaving the rabbit family behind him, the wizard made his way home. Around him, in the tall grass, the songs of crickets and locusts could be heard, bidding their own farewell to the fading sun, which was approaching the horizon at a leisurely pace. In the distance, dusk had already fallen, but everywhere the wizard looked, humans, animals, and whatever else lived under this evening sky seemed utterly content. And as he turned off the forest road onto the path leading to his house, his high beech tree, which had kept a silent vigil over his home, greeted him. His eyes wandered upwards to the treetop. Then he unlatched the massive wooden door, put his case down, and took a look around the house, like someone who had journeyed far and almost forgotten what his home looked like. With one more glance at the evening sky, the wizard closed the door. The magical hunch regarding his post might have been a red herring, but paying the post office a visit had been a good idea nonetheless. Of that the old man was certain. Meanwhile, at the rabbit family's house, Tim sat down at his father's desk, took a sheet of paper, and started writing, as neatly as he could. Dear wizard. So that the old man would remember this day, he wanted to write to him about how they had met Heinz, the kind hedgehog with his sandwiches, about the Hedgehog Brothers' song, about the boat bobbing up and down in the stream, and of course about the stout beaver, who was sure to deliver this letter reliably. Third story, on wood dwarves, badgers, and a false impression. Dwarves are a burly bunch. Everyone in Mousewood knows that. They are excellent miners and blacksmiths. They were even designated the guardians of important bridges until trolls took over that duty. The dwarves of Mousewood, called wood dwarves, were just as accustomed to hard work, even though, from the point of view of a burly dwarf, the work often didn't seem hard at all. 3 dwarves who rarely backed away from a challenge shared a home right in the middle of Mousewood. The eldest dwarf was called Steinberg. He was 85 years old. Even by dwarf standards, he couldn't be considered green anymore, even though his father and grandfather always teased young Steinberg at family celebrations. His fellow lodgers were called Logger and Soft Steel. Logger was 73 and had a magnificent forked red beard. Soft Steel was the youngest and had just had his 71st birthday, without making much song and dance about it. Dwarves like to party loud and long, and as often as possible, just not on birthdays. Maybe because they have so many of them. The dwarves' home lay deep within the forest, half above and half below ground. There were cellars and mine shafts reaching deep under the forest floor. The dwarves drove these tunnels and shafts deeper and deeper between the roots and the earth, hoping for new pockets of precious metal or other treasures in the soil. Around their home, the 3 dwarves cultivated beds of dwarf root. Dwarf root is not a particularly small root. It's called dwarf root because only wood dwarves cultivate it, because they know how to extract the precious blue juice. Blue juice is popular among the forest dwellers for its peculiar taste and slightly unpredictable effects. In any case, no one in Mousewood would ever think of small when thinking of a dwarf. In fact, dwarves are a good deal larger than mice, squirrels, or foxes. A fox could only match a dwarf in size if it tried to walk on 2 legs, like mice and squirrels sometimes do. Okay, granted, from time to time, even foxes try to walk on 2 legs. But if you ever see a fox trying to do so, you'll immediately know why these sly fellows chose a quadrupedal life. It's like watching humans try to crawl on all fours just for the sake of it. A ridiculous sight. In addition to their burly physique and knowledge of blue juice, there's another significant characteristic innate to all dwarves: grumpiness. No one knows why or since when. Even the dwarves themselves cannot recall, so each and every day they look for reasons to be grumpy. Actually, they'd be happy if they didn't find anything to be grumpy about, but there's always something to make them irritable. One morning, Steinberg was sitting at the kitchen table in their tidy house, waiting for his fellow lodgers. They had gone down to the cellar half an hour previously to get some honey for breakfast. The cellar is where the dwarves stored their food, since the cool, damp caves kept it fresh. Steinberg had everything already prepared. He poured out some fresh, cold milk, cut the bread into thick slices, and had a chunk of fresh butter. All that was missing was sweet, golden honey. Suddenly, Steinberg heard a loud grumbling coming from the cellar door, a grumbling he knew all too well. The dwarf already had a bad feeling about what was in store. Finally, his housemates climbed the creaking cellar stairs up to the living room and looked gloomily at Steinberg. "We're out of honey," Softsteel said, grimly putting out the lantern he had used to illuminate the cellar's depths. You could see in his expression that for him, a breakfast without honey was no breakfast at all. "And we won't find any up here either," growled Logger, running his tongue around his mouth, silently smacking his lips, as if this could conjure up the sweet taste he now had to do without. "Pah!" exclaimed Steinberg, something the dwarves make a habit of. "Pah!" he said again, getting up from his chair. "It's always the same, I tell you. The day's ruined." He stood with hands on hips, resting them on his broad leather belt, as if he were bracing himself for another ruined day. Slowly he calmed down and grumbled, "All right, no honey then." And eventually the dwarves sat down and had breakfast, if you could call it breakfast. "Pah!" Steinberg sputtered, his mouth full. Later on, the dwarves got ready for work on the root beds. They strapped their bags for gathering ripe roots over their shoulders and picked up their hoes and shovels and everything else they needed. Without another word, the wood dwarves left the house. A cuckoo's call echoed through the trees as Steinberg, Softsteel, and Logger inspected their root beds. It looked like being a very promising harvest. Many thick dwarf roots were ripening, waiting to be turned into delicious blue juice. Softsteel began to carefully till the earth around the precious plants with his hoe. Meanwhile, Logger checked the huge harvesting baskets for holes and other damage they might have suffered during the last shift. They seemed, however, to be in immaculate condition, despite the fact that they had been outside for weeks. Before they started harvesting, though, Steinberg would always smoke a pipe, which he kept along with his tobacco in a pouch on his belt. He began packing the tobacco. But just as he was about to light the pipe with a burning splint he had already lit with a lighter a relative had once crafted for him, he was startled by a yell. So startled, in fact, that his pipe fell out of his open mouth to the ground. "Hello! We need help!" a badger yelled as he ran towards the dwarf. Logger and Softsteel joined Steinberg, waiting to hear what the badger had to say. "Excuse me," the badger said, gasping for air and stumbling the last bit of the way towards the dwarves. "We've just moved into the neighbourhood," he said, gesturing nervously in a vague direction. "It's our cart. We're transporting my in-laws' furniture. If it falls over, my wife is going to—" The badger seemed to have difficulty imagining what his wife would do to him if the cart fell over. "Please come with me," he begged the dwarves. "Of course. We'll just drop everything and come and help," said Steinberg, and, with a weary sigh, tapped the remaining tobacco out of his pipe. The harvest would have to wait. The wood dwarves followed the badger to the place where he had got into difficulties. The big wooden cart was packed with old cupboards and other furniture. It was propelled by a bike-like frame fixed to the front. At least, at the moment it was fixed to the front, so long as it didn't get stuck in the mud and wasn't about to topple over, as was the case now. The badger's wife was waiting by the cart, trying to stay calm. She was not, however, having much success. As she saw her husband and the dwarves approaching, she ran up to them. "Are you here to help? The cart, do you see? Do you see?" she asked anxiously. Steinberg, Logger and Softsteel could see the cart clearly as it was directly in front of them. Softsteel groaned quietly. "That's my parents' furniture. It mustn't be damaged at any cost," she continued agitatedly. "It has so many memories. Do you see?" The three wood dwarfs had no problem seeing. Softsteel groaned again, a little less softly. "All right, boys, let's get down to it," said Steinberg, and the dwarves began to make a plan. Logger took a look at the cart, inspecting first the sides, then the front. Softsteel examined the mud, which had swallowed two of the wheels, while Steinberg checked the consistency of the path in front of and behind them. Eventually the dwarves started to search for thick branches to lever the cart from the mud's grip. While the dwarves were busy working and planning, they noticed the badger's wife talking secretively to her husband and looking up from time to time as if she was afraid they might grow suspicious. Steinberg didn't hear particularly well, but he did have a particularly good instinct for things said behind his back. For him, it was obvious the badgers were talking maliciously about him and his fellow lodgers, and that made him extra grumpy. Using branches as levers, the burly dwarves managed to pull the cart out of the mud in one go. Then they stabilized it by covering the track with twigs and leaves so the wheels wouldn't sink in again. "All right, give it a try," said Steinberg. The badger mounted the bike and pedalled as hard as he could. Slowly the cart moved forward along the track, rattling and rolling under its heavy load. "It's worked! It's moving again!" the badger said, coughing and hastily accelerating along the path. "Sorry, but I'd better not stop," he yelled, "otherwise it might get stuck again." His wife ran up to the cart and managed to clumsily climb on, sitting down on a cupboard. And thus the cart and its load of furniture lurched and reeled down the path. When Steinberg was sure they were out of earshot, he clenched his fists and gave a loud "Pah!" Softsteel and Logger looked at him inquisitively. "Didn't you see they were talking about us behind our backs?" he asked, infuriated. Actually, they hadn't noticed, but there were two things they knew for sure. Their friend was reliable about things like that, and they didn't like things like that. The dwarves were angry. "I'm used to people only coming over here if they need our help. Really, I'm used to that," said Logger dejectedly. "But talking about us behind our backs while we're helping, that's just—" Steinberg patted the disappointed dwarf on the back. None of them could imagine what the badgers had been saying behind their backs. "They'll always come up with something," grumbled Softsteel. So, with the harvest still to be done, the wood dwarves returned to their root beds. Hour after hour they worked to the very end of the day, which gave them a few more reasons to be grumpy. They grubbed out the roots with their shovels and hoes, plucked the precious plants from the earth and put them in their harvesting bags. When the bags were full of ripe roots, they emptied them into huge baskets waiting at the edge of the fields until even they were crammed full. The dwarves didn't take a break until all the roots had been gathered and the most exhausting part of the harvest was finished. It had been a rich harvest, but none of them could derive much satisfaction from it. Steinberg sat down at the edge of the field and puffed away at his pipe. Logger, lost in thought, gnawed on a straw. Softsteel didn't even want to ponder and spent his time cleaning the roots. Later they carried basket after basket into the house and stored them in their mine shafts, next to the machinery with which they liquidized the roots to gain the precious blue juice. They took their time on this, knowing that their thoughts would go back to the unfriendly badgers when they'd finished. Afterwards they wanted to spend the evening outside, so they took out a couple of chairs. Here, under the clear sky, they could let their thoughts roam and forget their troubles. Dusk began to fall, and in the distance birds started to sing, their songs ringing out clearly to every corner of dark and tranquil Mousewood. Gradually a completely different sound made itself heard. An uncanny, rattling, squeaking, barely audible at first, but growing in intensity until it could not be ignored. As the dwarves tried to spot the source of the noise, a faint light appeared between the trees, bumping back and forth while coming nearer. It was the badger, riding his bicycle cart. On the back stood his wife, holding something. As they arrived at the dwarves' home, the badger brought his vehicle to a halt and dismounted. "Hello again," he said. "We didn't have the chance to thank you properly. Without your kind help, we'd have been stuck forever." He then thanked every dwarf personally with a firm handshake. "Earlier on we were wondering how we could show our gratitude," his wife said, laughing. "No easy task, I can assure you. My husband Peter said you'd probably like a blueberry tart, but I thought you'd appreciate a rhubarb cake." As she spoke, she uncovered a rhubarb cake and gave it to a very surprised Steinberg. Taken unawares, the dwarves completely forgot the fact that they didn't actually like rhubarb cake. "Again, many thanks for your kind help," the badger lady said. "It was a pleasure," replied Steinberg, as he took the freshly baked cake with a slight bow, assuming that was the right thing to do. Logger shook hands with both badgers and mumbled, deeply moved, "Welcome to the neighbourhood." What Soft Steel would have liked to be a mumble, since he couldn't find the right words at this particular moment, turned out to be more of a touched sigh. With that, the badgers bade their farewells and rattled off on their cart. The wood dwarves watched the wobbling light until it was swallowed up by the darkness. Back in their house, Steinberg put the cake right in the middle of the table and slumped down on his chair. "Pah! So they brought us a cake," he said, and eyed the cake, which in fact for a rhubarb cake looked quite delicious. "Who'd have thought it? Looks like they actually brought us a cake," Logger agreed thoughtfully. Steinberg stood up and walked around the table, scratching his chin and thinking. The other dwarves looked at him expectantly, waiting to see if he had an idea. "We have to return the favour, or they might think we're bad neighbours," the oldest dwarf said firmly. And as he said it, he gestured towards the cellar door, where the freshly harvested dwarf roots were stored. Later on, the dwarves celebrated and ate the rhubarb cake with great pleasure. It had a very special taste, one you could really get used to. Then they raised their root beer-filled mugs to the new neighbours. Far into the night, the dwarf's home was filled with bright light, and thick blue steam spiralled into the night sky. And for quite some time, the rattling and sizzling of machinery could be heard coming from the cellar, as the first drops of the new season's blue juice were bottled. Fourth story: Mr. Brown and the Curious Case of the Reliable Hedgehog Brothers. It was a dull, windy day when Mr. Brown the mouse arrived. Only rarely did the sun poke through the heavy shroud of grey clouds over Mousewood. It had been days since Mr. Brown left his hometown, sleeping at different boarding houses and inns on the way. The further away he got from familiar territory, the more he felt it all becoming a fully fledged adventure. It was this desire for adventure that had, over the years, driven him to go on long journeys. This time it had been an invitation from his good friend Rushlight that encouraged him to take to the road again. Mr. Brown had met Rushlight on one of his journeys a few years back, and they had been friends ever since. In his letter, Mr. Brown's acquaintance invited him to visit Mousewood. This was where Rushlight had withdrawn to some 2 months previously in order to write poetry and read some of his more demanding books in the calm and tranquil ambience that the forest offered. For a hasty observer, it would have been easy to overlook Mr. Brown as he passed through Mousewood. The chubby little mouse had always been an inconspicuous fellow. A skilled observer, however, would have noticed a certain insecurity in Mr. Brown since entering the forest. He seemed to have problems getting around roots, sticks and stones, as these are rarely to be found in towns and cities. So Mr. Brown was preoccupied, holding his fedora firmly on his head to stop it falling off, while in his other hand he carried a big case. Despite this challenge, the mouse was actively enjoying roaming around this new territory. Between Mr. Brown's pink ears dwelt a lucid mind, which often proved helpful to his fellow mice, especially when complex tasks or tricky puzzles were involved. Following the directions Rushlight had given him, after turning left at the big birch and then going straight on, Mr. Brown reached his acquaintance's house. From a distance he could already see him in the front garden, sitting in a deck chair reading a book. Rushlight was a mouse of stalwart physique, who wasn't only tall, but also made a tall impression on everyone who didn't match his height. Mr. Brown hardly ever made a tall impression on anyone, at least not through his physique, since, even for a mouse, he seemed a little on the short side. Mr. Brown crept up and startled his friend by patting him on the shoulder. Rushlight sprang up from his chair and, recognizing his guest, exclaimed loudly, "My dear friend," and gave him a literally breathtaking hug. "You've made yourself at home, I see," said Mr. Brown, readjusting his hat. "Indeed, this really is the place to be," Rushlight said, spreading out his arms and taking a deep breath. "A couple of weeks in Mousewood will drive the city's grime and noise out of your head, I promise you. Seems like it's done you lots of good already. You almost squashed me," Mr. Brown remarked with a smile. "Well, it's a great pleasure to see you again," said Rushlight. "Can I offer you a drink?" "What kind of a guest would I be," his inconspicuous friend replied, "if I rejected such an offer?" "Still very much yourself, I see," said Rushlight with a laugh, and offered his friend a seat. Then he disappeared into the house. Mr. Brown sat down and carefully placed his case next to his chair on the forest floor. He relished the moment and looked up, finding the magnificent treetops much more beautiful than the buildings he was used to that filled the city's skies. Moments later, Rushlight returned with glasses and a jug. "It's an uncanny coincidence," said Rushlight, and poured Mr. Brown some lemonade. "But only yesterday I heard about a case that might interest you." Mr. Brown took a sip of his drink and listened to what his host had to tell him. "Over the last couple of weeks I've been taking long walks through the neighbourhood. Roaming the forest after months of dull city life changes you completely. Your spirits," said Rushlight, beating his chest, "return, and you're full of zest. So it was that yesterday I came across a house where a group of animals had gathered. Said house was a beautiful wooden construction, artfully crafted onto a tree trunk. As I found out later, the inhabitants had built it themselves. 2 hedgehogs, with a reputation of being excellent craftsmen. When you see the house, you'll agree that they deserve all the praise they get. Anyway, to find out what the animals were discussing so passionately, I addressed a beaver standing nearby. He explained that the previous night, the Hedgehog brothers, who own the house and the workshop behind it, had been the victims of burglars. It seems that both their tools and the materials they'd been working with were stolen when they left them in the back garden. Apparently, not even a tranquil, idyllic place like this is safe from thieves and their kind, concluded Rushlight. Mr. Brown listened attentively, looking into his glass that had now been reduced to 1/3 full. "Maybe you're right, dear friend," he said, "but we shouldn't be too hasty to call this theft." Rushlight refilled his glass as a magpie chattered above, spying on them. "What makes you think this could be anything other than the work of a common thief?" asked Rushlight, intrigued by the thought. "Well, according to your account, not only tools but also materials went missing. A thief only after things of certain value would have taken the tools but discarded the cheaper materials. In this respect, I think local burglars wouldn't differ from their city cousins." "You're right," agreed Rushlight, "but the question remains as to who stole the tools and materials, and for what reason." Determined to solve the mystery, Mr. Brown and Rushlight decided to pay the Hedgehog brothers a visit. If this wasn't the work of a common thief, maybe they would find some clue as to the culprit. After finishing the lemonade, Mr. Brown put his case inside the house, but took his umbrella, as heavy rain was forecast for Mousewood any time today. The two friends were in luck, and the rain held off. The ground, however, was still soaking wet with the rain of recent days. Whenever they encountered miry passages, Rushlight got through without difficulty, and Mr. Brown appreciated the fact his umbrella could also serve as a walking stick. Accompanied by the scent of earth and moss, the two mice walked along the path. The Hedgehog brothers' house was located a few paces from the edge of the forest, and was indeed a remarkable building. It wasn't enormous, not like a castle, but was of modest proportions, built in several layers and stories around the tree trunk. As the pair was looking at the Hedgehog brothers' house from the path, a lizard with a slouch hat emerged from the house next door and joined them. "You want to visit the Hedgehogs?" the lizard asked. "Yes, indeed," said Mr. Brown. "Is that their house over there?" "It is, and if I'm not mistaken, they've just had visitors. You should probably go over. It certainly looks like rain," the lizard said, pulling his hat a little deeper over his face. "Are you acquainted with the Hedgehog brothers?" asked Rushlight, leaning on the fence. "Yep, for ages, I might add. They're good neighbours, as everyone will tell you. Both of them are happy to do simple jobs for free, and they're reliable. The only thing is, the noise from all the hammering and sawing is unbearable," the lizard said with a rueful smile. "Yesterday was the first day in weeks I was able to take a nap in the afternoon." "I heard the Hedgehog's tools were stolen. That's probably why they couldn't disturb your nap, isn't it?" Rushlight asked. "That's the case. Yesterday morning they were gone," replied the lizard. "Despite the fact that burglary is a very rare occurrence in these parts, you know." The lizard took his leave and went off towards Meadow Pond. Mr. Brown scratched his head, while Rushlight opened the gate leading to the Hedgehog's home. Just as the visitors were about to knock at the door, it opened. The Hedgehog brothers were just taking their leave of guests, a lumpy mole lady and her smaller husband, who both wore thick glasses. Mr. Brown and Rushlight stepped aside to let the moles make their exit. "Mr. Rushlight, a pleasure meeting you again," said the corpulent mole lady with a smile. Rushlight, quite the gentleman and a chip off the old block, bowed politely. "How do you know my wife?" asked the male mole, looking reproachfully at Rushlight through his thick spectacles. "Why, Ludwig!" his wife exclaimed, dismayed. "We met this nice gentleman at the garden party near Marigold Meadows. He's from the city. He's here on holiday." The mole helplessly hung his head. "Well, I joined you quite late, so it's not surprising you don't remember me," Rushlight tried to help. "Please excuse my inadvertence anyway," replied the short-sighted mole, looking at Mr. Brown in a disoriented fashion. The latter was so amused he completely forgot to introduce himself. "How can I help?" asked one of the Hedgehog brothers. "We were hoping to discuss the disappearance of your tools with you," said Rushlight in a serious tone. The Hedgehog brothers nodded. Every bit of help was much appreciated, since this was already their second day without tools, the second day without work. "You heard about that too?" asked the mole lady, genuinely upset. "Someone took their tools in the middle of the night. They're the most reliable carpenters you'll find. They never forget anything nor leave work undone. And now their tools are gone. And that's not the worst of it. They were working on a new desk for my husband. Ludwig so enjoys writing letters. We'd almost finished the lady's commission, and suddenly our tools and cuts disappeared, sighed the hedgehog with the red dungarees. His brother in the blue dungarees blew his nose loudly into a large handkerchief. Mr. Brown looked at him with interest. The hedgehog blew his nose again and muttered hoarsely, "It's sad that our tools are gone, sure, but I've caught a cold and I've got a temperature." He coughed. Then he coughed again. "Please let us know as soon as you get your tools back," said the mole lady before saying goodbye. "But Lottie, the old desk will do just fine," said her husband as they left the hedgehog's yard, looking up at her insecurely. "And I haven't actually written any letters for quite a while." "I know," she replied, "but just wait till you sit at your new desk. You won't be able to stop writing." The mole sighed quietly. The hedgehog brothers led Mr. Brown and Rushlight around to their workshop behind the house. "Everything's just like it was the evening before we were burgled," the hedgehog in the red dungarees said. His brother stood a few paces away, giving his cold his full attention. "So you left your tools and the parts for the desk out here when you finished work for the day?" Rushlight asked. "Yep," said the hedgehog, looking around the workshop. It was empty, save for some sawdust on the grass. Mr. Brown looked up to the sky, his gaze following the shifting clouds. "Do you always leave your equipment out in the open like that?" he asked. "No. Usually we put our tools, materials and the like in that store over there. Not because of thieves, but because of the weather, you see. Tools need to be kept dry," the hedgehog explained. "Then why would you have left your gear outside in this weather?" the short mouse asked, lifting his fedora to scratch his head. The ill hedgehog let out a hacking cough. "He forgot." His brother rolled his eyes as if he had already heard the accusation 100 times. "Usually my brother takes care of these things because I'm absent-minded," he admitted. "In contrast to me, he's quite reliable, but as you can see, he's ill. As he's got this nasty fever, he went to bed early that evening, and I didn't think of putting our gear in the store. Strange thing if you think about it. The first time we forget to put our stuff away, someone steals everything." Mr. Brown took a good look around the yard. "Tell me, what do you use these other stores for, next to the one where you store your tools?" he asked. "Jars," the hedgehog replied. "We restock our supply a few months before winter and then lock the shelters. It's a long time since anybody's been in them. Luckily, the thief didn't break in there." "Indeed. Seems like a remarkable coincidence, some scoundrel picking precisely that evening to go off with your tools," said Rushlight. "Don't forget the materials. What would a thief do with the parts of a half-finished desk?" Mr. Brown pointed out. "Perhaps we're dealing with an inexperienced thief," the hedgehog suggested. "He just grabbed everything he could in a rush. Things rarely get stolen around here, so a lack of experience could explain that, don't you think?" "But a nervous thief would be in a rush. He'd sooner grab something more valuable than your boards. I'm convinced our thief took the materials on purpose. He must have had some special interest in those desk parts and your work," Mr. Brown concluded. The brothers suggested a cup of tea. The ill hedgehog led the way to the living room, staggering slightly from time to time. He seemed a bit dizzy. After going to the kitchen, he returned shortly afterwards and slumped into an armchair. Then he closed his weary eyes, swaying back and forth. "You should get some rest," Rushlight said in a worried voice. The hedgehog opened his eyes again, giving him a fatigued blink. "I suppose you're right," he said, and then turned to his brother. "You heard him. Would you care to put the kettle on?" His brother stood up with a smile and went into the kitchen. When Mr. Brown asked about cups, the hedgehog pointed out a cupboard from his armchair. Mr. Brown put 4 cups and saucers on the table. Then he sat back on the couch, which wasn't all that comfortable, since, for obvious reasons, the hedgehog brothers had no cushions. A few minutes later, the other hedgehog returned from the kitchen. "You'd already put some water on to boil," he said to his brother. "Had I?" he replied. "Well, so much the better." The hedgehog poured the tea for his guests and his sick brother, a tasty wild briar tea. "Our forest's famous for this," he informed the tourists. If he hadn't been saddened by the loss of his tools, he would probably have added a chuckle. But the brothers found this was no time for joviality. They did nevertheless talk to their guests about the forest, the town, and other things. As the ill hedgehog brother reached for his tea and took a careful sip, his brother said, "That's my cup." The sick hedgehog took a closer look. "Right," he said. "Sorry." Mr. Brown smiled. "Might I have a look at the key you used to lock up your store?" he asked humbly. Puzzled, the hedgehog brothers looked at each other. What could the mouse possibly want their key for? The ill hedgehog pulled the keychain out of his pocket and handed it over to the still smiling Mr. Brown, who examined it closely. "Am I right in assuming that these keys fit the locks on the other storerooms, where your supplies are stored?" he asked. "Yeah, that's right," the fit hedgehog confirmed. Mr. Brown went to the living room window and looked into the yard where the storeroom stood. "I think I may have just solved this puzzling case," he said. Rushlight and the hedgehogs were astonished when Mr. Brown suggested going out to the yard. Only the ill hedgehog stayed in the living room and watched them through the open window. "This is a good example of how even the trickiest cases can be solved over a nice cup of tea," said Mr. Brown. Up in the trees a few sparrows chirped. "Then who is the thief?" Rushlight asked impatiently. "There is no thief," Mr. Brown answered, "and there has been no theft." "But our stuff disappeared," the hedgehog said. "That is beyond doubt." "You're right, of course. So it's time to make it reappear," suggested Mr. Brown, and walked over to one of the stores where the jars for the coming winter were kept. He unlocked the door with one of the keys on the keychain and pulled it open. Between jerky and jarred fruit lay the half-finished parts of the desk and the tools. In fact, everything missing since yesterday morning. Rushlight was speechless, as was the hedgehog. "How did they get in here?" he asked in amazement. "Your brother did not, in fact, forget to clear up the workshop and your equipment," Mr. Brown explained. "After you finished work, he got up again, went to the yard, and, as reliably as always, put the material into the store. But just as he confused the teacups due to his fever, he also confused the stores. His tracks are clearly visible in the mud if you look out of the window, despite the fact that nobody has been there for weeks. When he had finished storing everything, he locked the door again and forgot he'd ever been there, just as he forgot he'd already boiled the water for our tea. That's why he was as puzzled as everyone else about the disappearance of your tools. Things like this happen when you're running a fever," Mr. Brown concluded. Rushlight slapped him on the back and exclaimed, "What a reliable fellow! He never forgets anything. Sometimes he just can't remember not forgetting." The hedgehog took a hammer out of the shelter, walked to the workshop, and, hiding the hammer behind his back, waved to his brother. "So, what's the news?" the sick hedgehog at the window asked. His brother produced the hammer. "Where'd you find that?" his brother asked, in as much amazement as his sore throat and dizziness would allow. The other hedgehog pointed at the store behind him. "Right where you put it, brother," he said, laughing. "Me?" the other brother asked, thinking hard. "Really? Well, okay." No one took his mistake amiss. If anything, he had once again proved his reliability. And you can't blame somebody for having a cold, now can you? Later, on their way home, Mr. Brown and his friend Rushlight took the time to enjoy the countryside before returning to the forest. Here, on the elevated northern edge of the woods, one could look far into the distance across the fields. The wind hustled big piles of grey clouds through the sky, which, where the sun managed to pierce the thick shroud, cast huge scudding shadows on the fields beneath. Fifth story, Plato's Song. Among the reeds of Meadow Pond sat Plato the frog, enduring the midday heat and the constant buzzing of the gnats. The insects had been in high spirits ever since Plato had told them a few hours earlier that he wouldn't be preying on them, at least until evening, when it got cooler. He was accustomed to feeding on fat flies, but didn't mind giving them a day off as long as they left him alone. In this heat, just the thought of shooting his sticky tongue out of his mouth was exhausting. Plato slipped into the water and relaxed. "Quack," he said contentedly, floating just under the surface of Meadow Pond. Just his head poked out of the water, and he watched opalescent dragonflies wheeling and zooming through the clear sky. With their huge compound eyes, the dragonflies could easily spot Plato, even when he was obscured by the water, so they showed off, flying aerobatics around him. At least that way they wouldn't tempt him to have a nice little snack. It's moments like these, when you should actually be feeling contented, that you realize there is something amiss. While Plato floated like a piece of wood, motionlessly pondering until he bumped into a water lily, his thoughts wandered to music. A long time ago, he had made music with 4 friends, by the pond or in glades, playing sessions which had brought them a certain amount of fame and recognition. Besides Plato the frog, the band consisted of Jonas, an otter from the north and a gifted trumpeter, Nicholas the lizard, an inspiring triangle player, Peter the badger, a master of the harmonica, and last but not least, Anya the mouse, who sang and played the accordion. Their ways had parted long ago after a heated argument, although today nobody could remember what it had been about. At the time, everyone went their separate ways and hadn't played together since. But even today, some forest dwellers remembered the small group of musicians and their sessions. Plato climbed out of the water and sat down cross-legged on top of a lily pad. He wanted to make music again. So why not pay his friends a visit this afternoon to maybe have a jam and relive the good old days? As this thought struck him, Plato sprang up, danced a couple of tap steps, spread out his arms and exclaimed loudly, "Quack!" It already sounded like part of a song. In a high arc, the frog leapt headfirst into the water and swam back to his house on the opposite bank. A small footbridge led to the water where a rowing boat was moored. Frogs, of course, do not generally need boats, but Plato always had one ready for those guests who weren't too keen on swimming and could thus still enjoy the idyll of Meadow Pond with him. Plato opened his front door, walked down the hall, and climbed the ladder leading to his bedroom. His home clearly marked him out as a music enthusiast. His walls were covered in posters of famous musicians who'd been at their peak decades ago and since fallen into obscurity. Great entertainers from a time when the streets of the big city were filled with infectious rhythms and catchy tunes. Crab Calloway, the singing crustacean, a remarkable band leader in a white suit. The Rat Pack, who were in fact 3 very successful mice and who cracked jokes together on stage while performing their most enjoyable songs. There was a picture of Maurice Skunk, a charming French singer. Plato even owned a record player and a collection of LPs with his favourite singers. Despite the fact it was still very warm outside, the frog put on a white shirt, black trousers and braces, as he always did when going out to visit friends or family. Even in weather like this, for Plato it was out of the question not to dress in style. Finally, Plato went to the living room and opened the big doors of a huge cupboard. Carefully he took out a case, put it on the table and unlocked it. The case contained Plato's violin. its polished red wood gleaming in the sunlight. He ran his hand over the precious instrument before closing the case and snapping the locks shut. Then the frog left to visit the friends he had lost sight of so long ago. As Plato didn't like walking along gritty paths with his thin-skinned feet, which were more suited to swimming and the living room, he decided to take his bike. He strapped his violin case onto the rack and started pedalling. First on the list to visit was Peter. As far as Plato knew, the badger now owned a bakery and sold pastries on the western outskirts of the forest. The quality of his bread was beyond question, with many customers happily confirming the fact every Sunday when he baked his famous Sunday rolls. Plato rode along the bank of the pond, then turned onto the track that led around Mousewood. The direct route through the forest was shorter, but by bike he'd be quicker if he rode outside the woods. En route he came across two humans, who watched the frog pass by with astonishment. "Look, a frog," said one to the other. "They live in ponds and pools and eat insects, I think." Soon the frog reached the western edge of Mousewood, where he got off and pushed his bike along the path, since he wasn't familiar with this part of the woods and didn't know exactly where to find his old friend. In front of a row of houses, two grandfatherly squirrels were telling stories of the old days, with a cluster of grand and great-grandchildren playing and laughing around them. When they saw the frog with his bicycle, the children stopped playing to get a closer look at the stranger. The seniors, however, were too busy talking to take any notice. Plato turned to them and cleared his throat. "Grandpa, I think the frog wants something," one of the kids shouted, staring at his grandfather and pointing at the frog. As he couldn't stare at Plato at the same time, the other children took that part. "Yes, what is it?" one of the elderly squirrels asked. "Excuse me," Plato began. "Could you tell me where I can find the local bakery?" "Bakery? The elderly squirrel mused. "Used to be right over there," he said, pointing to the left with his cane. "Then," he continued, "then it moved over there," and he pointed to the right. "Nowadays, though," he concluded, putting his cane back on the ground in front of him, "nowadays they're somewhere else. You'll find bread and pastries over there." Plato turned around. There indeed, with a shop window displaying the finest cakes and rolls, was the bakery. It was full of customers. "Many thanks," Plato said, and pushed his bike over the road. "That frog's got style," said one of the elderly squirrels to the other. Plato's braces obviously recalled his own youth, when the streets of the big city were filled with infectious rhythms and catchy tunes. "He reminds me of someone." The bakery was bustling with activity. The entrance or exit of every customer was faithfully marked by a tiny bell, and made no exception for our frog. Inside, the smell of freshly baked wares filled the air. Cakes and bread, but also rolls and cookies. Behind the counter, a badger attended to customer after customer. Plato wasn't sure how he should ask about Peter, and decided to join the short queue. A few minutes passed, accompanied by the bell's clear ring when the door opened or closed, and the sale of blueberry cake, cheese sandwiches, and coarse wholemeal and poppy seed bread. Eventually it was Plato's turn, and since he wasn't an ordinary customer, he tried not to confuse the baker too much. I am an old acquaintance of Peter's. I hope this is the right place to look for him," he said. "It certainly is," the badger lady replied. "I'm his sister. I'm just helping out. He's moving in with his wife, you know. That's why he's not here right now." "I see," said Plato thoughtfully. "Unfortunately, I can't reach him at the moment either. Would you like to leave a message?" the badger lady asked helpfully. "Just send him my best wishes, please. Best wishes from Plato the frog. I'd like to make music with him again." "Plato? I've heard of you. He'll be happy to see you again," she said. Here, have a few of our fresh cookies. On the house, she added with a twinkle. Thanks, said Plato. I'm sure they're delicious. An elderly mouse behind him elbowed her way to the front of the queue and said, Yes, we all think they're delicious. So it would be most kind if you would let the rest of us buy some as well. Plato was tempted to complain about the mouse's rude manner, but then remembered he wasn't an ordinary customer. So he left the shop, and the soft ring of the bell bade him farewell. The frog picked up his bike, brooding. There were still 3 music acquaintances from the old days left to visit: Anya the mouse, Nicholas the lizard, and Jonas the otter. Plato strapped the cookies on the rack of his bike next to his violin case and rode off. He seems somehow familiar, said the elderly squirrel with the cane as he watched the frog disappear. You're probably confusing him, old chap, his equally elderly friend replied. And if I am, then it's my business, said the other squirrel. He swung his cane through the air, pointed it towards the bakery, and shuffled, surprisingly quickly, across the road. Entering the shop, the squirrel had a look round. When he saw the badger lady behind the counter, he elbowed his way to the front, ignoring the numerous cries of, How dare you! Intolerable! What appalling manners! He wasn't that bothered. A squirrel of his age can do pretty well as he pleases. Excuse me, but who was that sprucely dressed frog who was here a minute ago? The old fellow asked the badger. That was Plato, the musician, she replied. Plato, of course, the squirrel exclaimed, smacking his paw against his forehead, angry that this hadn't occurred to him earlier. Behind the still irritated customers, yet another person shoved their way through to the front. This time it was Peter the baker, carrying a large box and wheezing, Plato the frog? Plato let the cool breeze play around his green head as he rode past fields and meadows and a group of mice and squirrels on a hiking trip. Eventually he reached an avenue of old trees offering much-needed shade. The frog dismounted and had a look round. Jonas the otter lived near the avenue, close to a small stream, so Plato left his bike at the track and walked down a narrow path leading to his friend's house. There he knocked on the front door. No one answered. There was no one home. Disappointed by his run of bad luck, Plato strolled back up to the avenue and decided to take a break from his roaming around. At that moment, a gentle melody wafted down to him. It was a robin, high in the treetops, and its song was so lovely, Plato stopped to listen. A few minutes later, the robin had finished and took off from the green canopy into the clear blue sky. But Plato was oblivious, having fallen asleep. While he was sleeping, Plato's dreams took him far, far away, as far as one can be taken by one's dreams. Yet, for a moment, he thought he heard 2 old squirrels, a badger and other animals walking through the forest, chatting. But so many dreamlike things happened in his dreams that the voices almost immediately slipped away again, and sleep had him back in its cosy arms at the edge of the forest. When Plato awoke, the sun had almost disappeared beyond the horizon, taking the warmth of the day with it and leaving sky and clouds to shine in the afterglow. Back on his feet, the frog took a few moments to grasp where he actually was. I must have fallen asleep, he thought. No wonder in this heat. Now, though, he was wide awake and well rested, and it was a really lovely evening. But now he could hardly visit his acquaintances, being reluctant to disturb people after sunset, and even more so uninvited. So Plato made his way back to Meadow Pond without having jammed with a single one of his friends. He sighed and reached for the cookie bag strapped to his bike rack. He took a cookie, and then another. Delicious, he thought, eating some more. When the bag was empty, he crumpled it up, put it in his pocket, and brushed the crumbs off his shirt. Then he switched on his bike lights and rode home. Night had not yet fallen when Plato reached Meadow Pond, but it was dusky enough to spot the fireflies as they sped through the reeds and tall grass in front of his house. Wanting to walk the rest of the way, Plato got off his bike, when suddenly someone leapt out of the bushes. "The frog! It's the frog!" shouted a little squirrel, pointing at Plato and scurrying off towards Meadow Pond. Plato was quite startled. Slowly he pushed his bike onwards, the sand crunching beneath its wheels. "We wondered when you'd turn up," shouted Peter the Badger, waving to him. With him were Anya, Nicholas and Jonas, all the musicians he used to play with so many years ago. There were also the grandfather squirrels, their grandchildren, and several other forest dwellers. They had decorated the footbridge to Plato's house with lanterns, and all of them were in a merry mood. The elderly squirrel he had talked to outside the bakery came up and said, "I always admired your music, you know. When I heard you wanted to play again, I gathered your former colleagues together and then waited for you right here. It seems you have quite a few fans," he said, pointing out the guests who raised their glasses of blue juice in greeting. Some of them Plato recognized as customers of the bakery. "Well then," said the frog, opening his case and taking out the instrument. The guests held their breath in anticipation. They were so quiet they could hear the soft sound of Plato picking up his violin and bow. Plato walked down to the footbridge, where his fellow musicians were already assembled. All four greeted Plato as if it had been yesterday when they last made music together. And then they were set. Anya the mouse picked up her accordion. Nicholas the lizard had his triangle at the ready, a bit nervous about playing in front of an audience again. Jonas the otter fiddled with the mouthpiece of his trumpet, calm as could be, and Peter took his harmonica out of his front pocket. "Why don't we start with Plato's song?" Anya suggested. The other musicians agreed, and Plato felt honoured, since he had composed Plato's song, one of their most famous pieces, back in their heyday. The band started to play, and their music sounded just like in the old days. The audience were enthusiastic, and more animals from the neighbourhood came to listen to the infectious rhythms. Even the toad family swam over from the opposite side of Meadow Pond and joined in. As the song ended, the frog danced a couple of tap steps on the footbridge where the boat for guests had been tied up, spread his arms wide, and, to applause from the audience, said loudly, "Quack!" And that's how Plato's song ends. Sixth story. Granny Mouse, George the Stag, and a mysterious place deep in the forest. It was early in the morning, and most of Mousewood's animals were still asleep. So if anyone had tried to gently wake them, telling them the sun was up and the birds were singing their morning songs, all they would probably have done was roll over, mumble, and sigh incomprehensibly, just like humans when they want to keep on dreaming. Some animals, though, were already awake, either because they enjoyed the silence when the forest itself still seemed asleep, or because they just couldn't sleep any longer. The latter applied to George the Stag. He'd struggled for days now to get a good night's rest. He always woke up early and couldn't get back to sleep afterwards. Sometimes he was so tired that he didn't even know if he was truly awake or still sleeping and dreaming. So George roamed the deep forest of Mousewood, where even animals who lived there could get lost on occasion. If someone had seen him, they wouldn't have got the impression he was tired at all, since stags have a natural tendency to look regal. If the mice and squirrels ever decided they needed a king, they would surely suggest a stag. A stag's antlers certainly look regal enough. But there was no need for a king, and even if there had been, George would probably just be a prince, since his antlers were still pretty short. The young stag, as drowsy as he was regal, continued his walk through the misty hills of Mousewood. He was in search of a clearing he had discovered a few days back and visited 3 mornings in a row. The strange thing was, the clearing wasn't easy to find. Every morning, it seemed to George, it was in a different place. The glade was as wide as a field. There was tall grass, and the murmur of a stream could be heard nearby, even though it wasn't visible through the reeds and dense bushes. Right in the middle of the glade, still wreathed in mist, stood a huge gnarled tree, with a thick trunk, grand roots that went for miles deep into the earth, and mighty branches towering high towards the sky. George found this tree different from other trees. He liked trees. In fact, George knew many of them, and this one was different. Probably because it grew in such isolation. This enormous tree didn't seem to have anybody for company. Maybe that was why he liked to be around it. George stood next to the tree and looked around the clearing. He wondered what the tree was thinking. "You're an early bird, aren't you?" a cawing voice asked. Startled and bewildered, George looked around, but he couldn't see anybody. Was it the tree talking to him? The answer flapped down to George from a branch up in the green treetop, landing just above his head on a stumpy branch. A coal-black raven, his feathers shimmering mysteriously more blue than black in the day's first sunlight. The bird fluffed up his feathers and made himself more comfortable. "You've been here a couple of times now, haven't you?" he cawed. George nodded. Sitting on his branch, tilting his head to the left, then to the right, the raven peered at him. His black eyes glinted despite the morning mist. "The likes of you rarely venture here," the raven said, gazing across the glade. "This place isn't easy to find. It's as if it were constantly on the move. Yesterday it seemed to be somewhere different, the same the day before," said George. "But I was probably just too tired to find it." "Quite the contrary. You found it because you were still dreaming a little," the raven said. "In their dreams, everybody knows how to find this place. Whoever sleeps will know the way." "What do you mean?" asked George. "Dreamers visit this place," replied the raven. "And sometimes they come here even though they're awake. Then two may sit here by the tree and look into each other's eyes. Sometimes a poet comes, or a badger with brush and easel to paint the tree. But they rarely recognize this place from their dreams, even though they've been here many times." George half understood what the raven was telling him, but was utterly confused by the other half. Pondering, he pawed the ground with his front hoof. "And who are you?" he asked. "The memory of everyone who leaves here is imprinted. A raven once came here. After he left, I remained as part of the tree's memory. It remembers many things, and its memory runs as deep as its roots, for it was the first tree. Without it, there would be no forest. Even when its time had passed, it remained intertwined with the forest. Now its roots not only grow to every part of the forest, but also reach into the realm of thoughts and dreams. It knows all the forest's secrets." "But why is it remembering you right now?" George asked, looking at the glade again. There was no one else there, just the raven. "Because I visited it once and sat beside it here in the foggy dew, just like you. So I crossed its mind. It's a wonderful morning, isn't it?" asked the raven, eyes glinting. George nodded. The raven soared skywards again and disappeared in the green canopy. What was left of the morning mist glowed faintly on the meadows under the gentle touch of the sun's light. High above, The wind began to sing in the branches, while the trunk softly creaked. George decided to return to the more populated parts of Mousewood. The stag had the urge to talk to someone less enigmatic than the Black Raven, so he ran through the tall grass back to the forest. After a while he turned back, but the glade had vanished. Where it had been just moments before, the trees now formed dense ranks, and George wondered if the tree would remember him as well. It was still early, but Mrs. Mouse the mouse was already busy. The old lady was preparing breakfast for her grandchildren, who were visiting her. She had already been to the baker's, luckily bakers are early birds as well, and bought some rolls. So the breakfast table was already set when her grandchildren, Lars and Jess, came tumbling down the stairs surprisingly early. They scurried over to the table, still in their pyjamas. Mrs. Mouse would have loved to pinch their cheeks because they looked so adorable. Then she remembered how she had hated having her cheeks pinched when she was a child, so she spared her grandchildren. Instead, she put a big glass of milk for them each on the table and tousled their hair. "Well, you two," she said, "you're up early." Lars raised his glass with both hands and took a long swig of cold, fresh milk. His big brown eyes looked out from behind the glass. After a swig that size, he needed a while and took a deep breath before he could answer. "Yes," Lars said excitedly, "because we're going to sell lemonade outside." "Lemonade?" asked his granny. "Do you know how to make lemonade?" "I can make lemonade," Lars replied, even more excited now. "Drinking lemonade is what you're good at," said Jess, who was a bit older than Lars, as he buttered his roll and daubed it with jam. "But you don't know how to make it." "I do, with lemons," said Lars. After breakfast, Granny Mouse made a jug of her tasty lemonade and gave it to Lars and Jess to sell in glasses to passers-by. They'd been inspired by their good friend Humbert. Even though he was a bit of a know-all, they still had a good time with him. Lars carried a small empty box from Granny's garden to the forest track, while Jess followed with a bigger one. Side by side on chairs, the boxes made an excellent booth for selling lemonade. All that was missing was a sign telling potential customers what was for sale and how much it cost. "How much is a glass of lemonade anyway?" Lars asked. "It's not so much what we charge, but how much a thirsty customer is willing to pay," Jess replied like a true salesman, pacing up and down. "You mean they just give us as much as they like?" Lars asked, scratching his left ear. That wasn't what Jess meant, but he liked the idea anyway. "If we are that generous and let people just pay as much as they want, they may give us lots of money," he said, telling Lars what to write on the sign. Lars was good at writing, even though he hadn't started school yet. "Tasty lemonade. Price, customer's choice," is what the mice wrote on the sign, and then they waited for their first customer. From time to time, someone passed their booth with a friendly greeting, but no one wanted a glass of lemonade. Then Oswald the squirrel came along and was intrigued by the sign. "Just think about what you'd be willing to pay for a glass," Jess suggested. Oswald thought about it. After a while, he asked, "So I determine the cost?" "Yep," said Jess, already worried this would be too challenging and their first customer wouldn't enjoy thinking about the price of lemonade. Oswald ran off and climbed a tree some distance away. He briefly disappeared from sight, then reappeared on one of the trees nearby. He had a big, shiny acorn with him. "This one's perfect," Oswald said, polishing the acorn with the back of his paw so it shone even more. The young mice accepted Oswald's payment and poured him a glass of lemonade. He drank slowly, sip by sip. "Tasty," he said, returned the glass and took his leave. Lars and Jess put the shiny acorn on the counter and waited for more customers. Suddenly there was a suspicious rustling in the bushes. but the mice were concentrating on the path in front of them. "Psst," the bush behind them said. "Did you say something?" Jess asked, but Lars shook his head. "Psst, psst," the bush said, now louder. The brothers turned around, and a stag poked his head out of the shrubbery and grinned at them. "George," Lars said happily. "Hey, you two, what are you up to?" George asked. "We're trying to sell marmalade," Lars answered. "Lemonade, not marmalade," Jess corrected his younger brother. "Lemonade," Lars amended. "Look, we got a nice shiny acorn for one glass." George took a closer look at the acorn. It was so shiny he could see his own reflection in it. "But it's really not as valuable as a glass of tasty lemonade," Lars said. A little later on, Soft Steel the wood dwarf came by the booth, making no effort to wish the kids a good day. He was about to walk by without a word. "Excuse me," George called after him. "What is it?" the wood dwarf asked, turning round. "Do you like lemonade?" the stag inquired. "I certainly do," replied the dwarf, sceptically peering at the mice and the stag. "And now I suppose you want me to pay." "But you choose how much," Jess clarified. "Pah! On top of all that I have to choose," the dwarf groaned, pulling a face and pretending to be bored. "Maybe you'd like to carve something?" George asked. He knew that dwarves were fine craftsmen who probably put all their sensitivity into their craft and hadn't much left over for other occasions. "You want something carved?" the dwarf asked the mice. Lars handed Soft Steel the shiny acorn, and the dwarf eyed the material. Then he pulled the knife from his belt pouch and asked, "And what should I carve for you?" Lars looked around. His eye fell on George, standing next to him, looking very regal. Lars whispered something to Jess that his brother seemed to think was a good idea. "Carve us a George," Jess said. "All right. Well, get yourself into a proper pose," the dwarf demanded. So George took up an even more regal pose, and Soft Steel began to carve. From time to time he looked up at George and then continued carving. Eventually he blew the shavings from the acorn's surface, took a critical look at his work, and then showed it to the mice. The dwarf had captured a good likeness of George on the shiny acorn. A fine work. Jess took the acorn and thanked the dwarf respectfully. "My lemonade," Soft Steel said, pointing at the empty glass on the counter. He made no effort to make this sound like a request. The children poured him some lemonade. The dwarf gulped the glass down in one go and left. When he was sure that he was out of sight and earshot, however, Soft Steel smacked his lips loudly, since the lemonade had been truly delicious. "Now we have a really valuable acorn," Lars cheered. Mrs. Mouse came out of her house to look for her grandchildren and was happy to see George with them. The kids showed her their new carving, and she immediately recognised George's image. Since he had had such a good idea, the stag was given the rest of the lemonade. Jess took the jug and poured it directly into his mouth, as stags rarely have their hands free. "Another satisfied customer," George commented, licking his lips. "And as a customer, I choose what I pay. So, why don't we go lantern rambling tonight? What do you think, Mrs. Mouse?" "Oh, I haven't done that for a long time," the old lady said, wondering if this wasn't a touch too adventurous. Then she said, "As long as we take it slowly. My legs aren't what they used to be." "Yay!" Jess shouted. "Hooray!" said Lars. George promised to pick the mice up at twilight. Lantern rambling is an old tradition in Mousewood. When the days get shorter, the forest dwellers light colourful paper lanterns with their children and go for an evening walk. After sunset, Lars and Jess put on warm coats and waited outside. Mrs. Mouse joined them and gave her grandchildren sticks to hang their lanterns on. The little ones could hardly wait for George to take them and their granny for a walk through the forest. Mrs. Mouse picked up the lanterns and unfolded them. Then she put candles inside and lit them. Lars got his first. It was shaped like the sun, with a jolly illuminated face. The flickering candle flame made the sun's smile curiously vivid. Then Granny Mouse hung Jess's lantern on its stick, a radiant crescent moon gazing dreamily into the night. The children held their lanterns carefully so the candles would burn brightly and steadily. "Okay, take good care of your lanterns," Mrs. Mouse said. "You can wait outside for George, but stay near the house." "Yes, Granny," Jess said. Mrs. Mouse returned to the kitchen to prepare dinner, since everybody was sure to be hungry after their walk. Outside, Lars and Jess waited with their lanterns for their friend. "George is certainly taking his time," said Lars, cautiously dangling his lantern. "Yeah, I hope he's all right," Jess replied. "Do you know where he lives?" Lars asked with a worried look. "Somewhere over there, I think," his brother said, pointing down the forest path which disappeared into the dusk. "We could go and meet him halfway." "But Granny said we should wait here," said Lars. "We'll go and meet him and come back to pick up Granny," Jess said. His little brother found that quite reasonable. So the two mice walked slowly down the track with their lanterns till all one could see was a jolly sun and a dreamy moon dancing faintly in the trees. Shortly after, George the Stag arrived at Mrs. Mouse's house and knocked at the door. The grandmother greeted him warmly. "Good evening. Are you all ready?" she asked him, and took her warm coat from the hook by the door. "I'm ready," George replied. "Where are Lars and Jess?" asked Mrs. Mouse, buttoning her coat. She felt a little uneasy. "Why, they're not outside, if that's what you mean," George said, now sharing her unease. Mrs. Mouse ran outside and looked around. There was no sign of her grandchildren. "Where are they? They were out here a minute ago," she said, her voice shaking. The old lady desperately looked about for the children. George's stomach ached at the thought that Lars and Jess were out there in the dark on their own. "Come on, we've got to find them," George said, and knelt down to let Mrs. Mouse climb on his back. Granny Mouse wrapped her scarf around her neck and didn't hesitate for a second before climbing on the stag's back. "Hold on tight," George said. Then he got up and moved off into the darkness in search of the children. "Lars!" George shouted through the nocturnal forest. "Jess!" Mrs. Mouse shouted. But there was no answer to be heard, nor lantern to be seen. "Where are you?" their grandmother called as loud as she could. They came across some other animals, like Conrad the owl and a couple of polecats, but none of them had seen the kids. And so the stag ran through the woods with the grandmother mouse on his back, shouting their names in the dark. Fallen leaves whirled into the air behind them as the stag dashed through the dusky trees. Soon they'd covered a great deal of the neighbourhood, so the stag went into the deeper, less populated parts of the forest. But still there was no trace of the two mice. "Should we search somewhere else?" George asked, worried, scanning the shadows. "I don't know," Mrs. Mouse said in a low voice. Then something occurred to her. "Wait, I've just remembered where I used to sit with my husband," she said hopefully. "Where's that?" the stag asked. Mrs. Mouse tried to remember, and the stag wondered how the old lady planned to find the way in the dark. "Just go straight on," she said, as if she could see the place in front of her. So George went straight on. Suddenly they emerged from the trees in a glade, the same glade where George had talked to the raven that morning. The huge tree towered on the other side of the clearing, bathed in pale moonlight. George ran over to the tree. "This is where I used to sit with my husband, right under that tree when we were young. It's so long since I've been here." "George, can you see the little ones?" asked Mrs. Mouse with hope in her voice. "My eyesight isn't what it used to be." Is there someone there? George peered over at the tree, and down at the bottom of the trunk there was indeed somebody. He struggled to see who it was. Then he made out two figures, but not Jess and Lass. George didn't know if he could trust his eyes. Down in the shadows sat a young girl mouse and her boyfriend. They were holding hands and smiled shyly at him. The young mouse reminded him of the grandmother on his back. Next to the couple stood a stag, but George could only see his silhouette in the shadows cast by the silvery moonlight. Curiously, it felt like looking into a mirror. The tree remembers us, he thought, reminded of the raven's words. It's not the kids, he said quietly to the grandmother. Then let's ask these nice people if they've seen my grandchildren, said Mrs. Mouse, wondering why George was so quiet. Have you seen two children? George asked aloud. The mice pointed to the right into the forest. The other stag paced around in the tree's shade, calling to someone up in the treetop. George couldn't hear what he said as he was too far away. A big bird descended from the high branches, flapping towards George and Mrs. Mouse. In the moonlight, George recognised the raven he had met that morning. "Follow me, will you?" called the raven, soaring over their heads in the direction the mice had pointed. Mrs. Mouse held on tight, and George trotted across the meadow to the glade's edge. The black raven flew between the trees, his silhouette merging with the forest's darkness. George followed him. When they were back in the woods, the raven disappeared. Instead, they saw a smiling sun and a sleepy moon floating between the trees, as if waiting for something. "Children!" Mrs. Mouse called from the stag's back. "Granny!" the children shouted, running towards them, but carefully so their lanterns wouldn't go out. "You were supposed to stay at the house," their grandmother said, with a mixture of anger and relief. The kids looked sheepish and apologised. "Where were you, anyway?" George asked, slightly out of breath due to all the running and yelling. "We were looking for you," Lass explained. "But it seems you were somewhere completely different." George and Mrs. Mouse and the kids made their way through the dark forest. After a while, they found the track leading to Granny Mouse's home. They didn't talk much on the way, as it had been an exhausting evening for all of them. Around them, the woods were so silent that all that could be heard was the soft rustling of leaves beneath their feet. Just before they reached the house, Lars' lantern went out with a faint fizzle. The jolly sun went dark. Shortly afterwards, Jess's sleepy moon also expired. George was relieved that the candles had lasted so long. Without their light, they wouldn't have been able to find the children so easily in the dark. When they reached the mice's house, George bade them farewell. The house was far too small for a stag, and he was also very tired. After saying goodbye, the mice had dinner and went to bed. When Lars and Jess had brushed their teeth and crawled under their warm blankets, Granny Mouse assured them that she wasn't angry any more. She was just happy to have them back, safe and sound. The children had to promise their grandmother not to run away again. Then she tucked them in and put the lights out. And shortly after, both little mice fell asleep. Their granny waited for a while, listening to Jess mumble in his sleep. He already seemed to be dreaming. The old lady went downstairs, and later, sitting in her armchair, she looked around her. On a cupboard stood pictures of her children and grandchildren. One showed a girl mouse and her husband. Next to them lay the shiny acorn carved with George's image. George was probably at home now, Mrs. Mouse thought, also probably recovering from a tiring evening. She greatly appreciated the stag's help in finding the little ones, and after a while, Mrs. Mouse fell asleep in her armchair. In every forest there is a tree. the first tree in the whole forest. So old it knows almost everything, with roots deep in every corner of the forest, even in the realm of our thoughts and dreams. Seventh story. When the animals wanted to drive a stranger out of their woods, but found a friend instead. Spitzweg the marmot was a wanderer. His current journey was coming to an end, since just a few steps separated him from home. Just a few steps till he set foot in his beloved Mousewood again. Spitzweg had travelled far. He had seen the sea and the mountains. He had rafted rivers, taken trains, and met many animals, even making friends in places where people welcomed him in foreign languages. All this just proved him right, he thought to himself. A friendly fellow is welcome everywhere. Marmots, by the way, are small animals which are similar to mice or squirrels, but which are in fact marmots. Spitzweg turned to the dirt track he'd walked as a kid on the way to school. Today the track seemed so much narrower. The marmot was looking forward to putting his rucksack down and his feet up when he got home. But he was not quite there yet. Suddenly the ground beneath Spitzweg began to shake. At first the wanderer thought it was an earthquake, as he had experienced on his travels. Then he remembered there were no earthquakes in Mousewood. If the earth shook here, there was only one explanation. And indeed, suddenly about 20 wild boar crashed out of the dense undergrowth and stampeded past him, blazing a trail through the forest. At first glance it looked as though they did so recklessly, flattening everything in their path. A keener observer, however, could see they were extraordinarily careful and had a keen eye for their surroundings, even though they were en route to their favourite wallow. This became clear when one of the hogs noticed Spitzweg. He broke away from his fellow boars, ran a curve, and approached the wayfaring marmot at hog speed. "Are my eyes playing tricks on me again?" he grunted loudly. "No, big fella, they aren't," Spitzweg said to the tusker. "Spitzweg!" he called and squealed so loudly one would have been forgiven for trembling in fear. "Welcome home!" This was music to Spitzweg's ears. Coming home always feels good, but it feels even better if someone welcomes you, especially if it's a good friend like Fiddler the boar. Fiddler was of impressive size, so impressive, in fact, that no one dared take his chances with this hulk of a hog. As a piglet, he had often been mocked, without the other children needing a particular reason. He was just a piglet, a pushover. But Spitzweg had looked after Fiddler, and so they had long been good friends. "How are you? How was your journey?" asked the boar. "Good," replied Spitzweg. "So many stories to tell. But I'm heading home first. Sleep is the reward for staying up all day, and I think I'm going to collect my share." "You should get some rest then," Fiddler grunted. "Good to have you back." "It's good to be back," said the marmot, amicably patting the boar's bristles and raising some dust. They walked some way down the path when a sudden noise startled them, a human noise. Spitzweg and his friends hid in the bushes at the wayside. Humans tend to get nervous if they come across wild hogs or marmots, and you never know what a nervous human will get up to. So animals prefer to keep some distance between them and humans, as at least the rarer specimens inevitably make humans extra nervous. The human roaming nearby, however, didn't seem one of the nervous kind. He was trying to whistle a tune. It wasn't quite clear what song it was supposed to be. Whistling obviously wasn't one of his strong points. The young man looked to the left and right as he passed the bushes where Spitzweg and Fiddler were hiding. "Reminds me of my brother," Fiddler whispered. The hog didn't say this because of a physical resemblance, but because his whistling sounded very much like Fiddler's brother. Suddenly, out of the blue, a chestnut hit the young man on the back of the head. "Hey!" he said, looking around. But since there was no one to be seen, he thought the chestnut had just fallen from one of the trees. He didn't realise there were only beech trees growing around him, and very rarely do chestnuts drop from beech trees. Then, just as the young man wanted to stroll on, the beeches seemed eager to make some more exceptions. Pock, pock, pock! A volley of chestnuts and acorns hit him on the back and head. That started to make the human nervous. He tried to duck and dodge, but, clumsy as humans are, he staggered, fell full length on the ground, and later out for the count. Pock! Another acorn hit him on the head. "Give him a break, I think he's had enough," someone shouted from above. As the human was no longer something to be feared, and they wanted to know what was going on, Spitzweg and Fiddler left their hiding place. 3 young weasels climbed down the trunk of a beech tree and cautiously approached the unconscious man. All 3 had shoulder bags packed with chestnuts. From behind a nearby tree, Humbert the mouse also came out of hiding, his sister Tina clinging to his hand. His mother had once again made him babysit his little sister. He wasn't too keen on that, as he then had to take her into account when planning his adventures. "What are you up to, boys?" Spitzweg asked the weasels. "Who wants to know?" the tallest of the weasel boys asked. "My friend and I do," Fiddler grunted, growling and clawing the ground. This made an impression on the weasels. It even made them flinch. Little Humbert, however, seemed not so easily impressed. He faced Fiddler and the marmot. His sister wanted to befriend the brawny boar and tried to go over to him, but her brother kept a tight grip on her hand. "We just wanted to chase away that human," Humbert explained. "I see," Spitzweg said with arms folded. "He didn't get very far, did he?" He approached the human and put his hands on the man's body. He felt his chest rise and fall. He seemed all right, considering he'd been scared unconscious. He'd be back on his feet soon enough. "Humans don't belong in our woods," said one of the weasels. Spitzweg looked at him blankly. "Humans don't belong here?" he asked. "You know what humans are like," replied the weasel. "They trample through our forest, disturbing the peace," said another weasel. The third weasel nodded frantically in approval and said, "Right, they disturb the peace." "They come here and think they can do as they please," the first weasel added. "We must put a stop to it. We must finally put a stop to it." "A stop to it," said Humbert's little sister, smiling brightly at her new friend Fiddler, proud she had repeated the sentence so well, even though she didn't actually know what it meant. "What exactly did that human do to you? Did he whistle too loudly?" Spitzweg asked, as he couldn't stand it when someone was harassed, especially if they hadn't done anything wrong. Even if that someone was a roughly 6-foot-tall human who stumbled over his own feet and couldn't whistle properly. "Well, he hadn't done anything yet," admitted one of the weasels. "Maybe not," the second weasel intervened, "but only because we didn't give him the chance. 5 minutes later, he might have stomped through somebody's garden or grabbed your neighbour because he needed a warm hat for winter." "Right," the third weasel confirmed. "A hat." "I've heard of humans doing such things," Humbert said all-knowingly. "You know how humans are. Humans leave their litter wherever they go. They pick flowers and gather mushrooms from our clearings. And then they go home again." "Right," said all 3 weasels simultaneously. "So you think all humans are like that?" asked Spitzweg. "Of course. It's always the same with them. I dare you to say otherwise," said one of the weasels belligerently. "You're a cheeky chappy, aren't you?" growled Fiddler, looking fiercely at the weasel. "I'm sorry," the weasel whispered meekly. Tina giggled, as she found his fierce face quite amusing. "You know, I've been to many places during the last couple of years. Up in the north I was even attacked by an albino penguin." "Believe me, it's not always the same with humans," said Spitzweg, pointing at the young man lying on the ground. "If you think all humans are alike, you might as well say all mice are alike." He looked at Humbert. "Well, we may look similar," the young mouse admitted, "but we're not all alike. My Uncle Henry, for example, he's different. He's a gardener and he talks to his ivy." "There you are," said the marmot. There certainly are humans who are gardeners, just like your uncle is. Some humans may on occasion disturb the peace and misbehave. But if somebody strolls through the forest whistling, that's no reason to chase him away. Whistling is not a crime. Robins whistle too, Humbert admitted. My brother whistles, Fiddler remembered. The wind whistles when it blows through the hole in my wall, one of the weasels said. The other two looked at him inquisitively. Really, just like someone who was whistling, explained the weasel. Whistling or not, yelled one of the other weasels, you can't compare humans to animals. They don't belong in the forest. They should stay where they belong. They should just leave us alone. You want the humans to leave us alone? Asked the marmot. If the humans knew you were throwing chestnuts at ramblers, you can imagine it wouldn't be peaceful here for very long. We don't like getting hit by chestnuts either, do we, boys? Added Fiddler the boar. Humans aren't all the same, apart from the fact they don't like being hit by chestnuts, and in that they're no different from us animals, Spitzweg said, and faced the young man. Just look at him. Doesn't he look peaceful? The animals fell silent. They listened to the humans breathing. Humans even benefit the forest, Spitzweg said calmly. They wander our woods and collect acorns, beechnuts and chestnuts. And when they dispose of the seeds, maybe a new tree grows there. A new forest could even grow in another place. Humbert, who was easily persuaded by scientific explanations, approved. Sounds reasonable, he said. As long as they don't do anything unfriendly, we can consider them our friends, Spitzweg concluded. The weasels liked the idea of having a giant as a friend, so they had a pretty bad conscience for treating the man so harshly, even though they would never have admitted it. They put down their chestnut-filled shoulder bags. One of them cautiously walked over to the unconscious human and put a chestnut into one of his jacket pockets, as a sign of friendship, and in the hope that the human would throw it away where the humans lived, where there weren't so many lovely trees as in Mousewood. The human started mumbling and sighing in his sleep. The animals couldn't quite get what he was saying, but it sounded something like, "Where's the deck of cards?" The weasels looked at Spitzweg as they believed he knew what the human was talking about. But the marmot just shrugged. Humbert's little sister let go of her brother's hand and ran over to the slumbering visitor. "Tired?" she asked, and touched the huge human's nose with her small paw. That seemed to tickle the unconscious man. He suddenly started moving. Humbert took his sister's hand, and the animals swiftly retreated to the bushes at the roadside. From there they watched the man regain consciousness. He smacked his lips, scratched his nose, and opened his eyes. "Look, he's awake. Can you see him looking around?" Spitzweg asked the youngsters. "Yes," said Humbert, watching excitedly, as the human first supported himself with his hands and then struggled to his feet and stretched to full size again. What imposing creatures those humans were! Of course you had to be careful with them, since they could possibly become erratic. But watching a wild human was truly a unique experience. The young man got up and dusted himself down. He wondered what had happened and why he'd woken up on the ground. Finally, he accepted the idea he had tripped over, the thought that clearly embarrassed him. He looked around to make sure no one had witnessed his misfortune, but there were no humans or animals to be seen. So he relaxed and started whistling again. Just as he was about to walk on, he discovered something in his pocket. "Look, he's found my chestnut," one of the weasels said. "And he's looking at it very closely. He seems to like it, doesn't he?" one of the other weasels commented. The human turned the chestnut over in his palm and obviously found it a lovely chestnut. He put it back in his pocket and took it along with him. Then the animal's new friend wandered off down the forest track, whistling. The animals watched him disappear, and little Tina waved to him. "Goodbye," she said. How come you know so much about humans? One of the weasels asked Spitzweg. I've learned many things about them on my journeys, he answered. But I've also seen a lot of animals that would seem strange to most people in Mousewood. Have you seen a tapir? One of the weasels wanted to know. Indeed, I saw one in a park in the city, Spitzweg replied. They've got stripes, haven't they? Another weasel inquired. The tapir I met didn't have any stripes, Spitzweg said. I always thought tapirs had stripes, at least 2 or 3 on their backs, the weasel said, pondering. There may be tapirs with stripes. It's possible, the wayfaring marmot admitted. I had stripes when I was little, Fiddler the Boar said. Uncle Henry has stripes too, added Humbert. Then he bade the others good-bye, as he had to take his little sister home. It was already past noon, and both had to be back for lunch. Little Tina said good-bye to the large boar and walked off with her brother. A few quick good-byes later, the weasels left as well. All 3 of them were still a bit upset, having been taught a lesson by the marmot and his brawny friend. But in the end, the marmot was right. Sleep is the reward for staying up all day, and I think I'm going to collect my share, Spitzweg said again to his friend the boar. Then go and get your well-earned rest, grunted his tusky friend. They walked to the marmot's home near Buttercup Meadows and agreed to meet later that evening and enjoy some pints of blue juice. Because blue juice was unique to Mousewood. Spitzweg unlocked the door and stepped into his shady house, the home he had been so far away from for so long. Finally, the marmot could leave his heavy rucksack on the floor and fall onto his cosy couch. The young man, meanwhile, had reached his family's house and was about to let himself in. Then he remembered the chestnut in his pocket. The human looked at the shiny red-brown chestnut from Mousewood. Not knowing what else to do with it, he tossed it into one of the flower beds in the garden. Maybe he had a hunch that that was just the right place for it. 8th story. Last but not least, a wizard proven right, and a badger finishes his work. Ludwig Mole sat at his new desk, looking through his thick spectacles at the letter he had written so very carefully. He'd reread the lines several times now, just as carefully as he had written them, to make sure he hadn't misspelt anything. The mole was no seasoned writer. Back in the old days he had occasionally written his wife long letters. That was many years ago, but his wife still saw the bold writer of days long gone in him, so she took every opportunity to remind her husband of his talents. She had a soft spot for talented animals. That's why she was also the head of the Mousewood Art Society, organising exhibitions and readings every second Thursday, featuring paintings and poems by Mousewood's resident artists. If there was an exhibition or reading scheduled, letters had to be sent to all members of the society, and Ludwig had to write those letters. Admittedly, his new desk did make the work actually more convenient. This letter, however, was especially important. Ludwig got up from his chair, took the letter and walked over to the massive wooden door leading from his study to the hallway. If he had employed a secretary, this is where she would have sat, typing on her typewriter. But Ludwig didn't have a secretary. What he did have, however, was a kind neighbour who helped him write the letters. Nicholas the lizard sat in the hallway, his slouch hat in his hands. As Ludwig entered, Nicholas rose, straightening his jacket. "G'day," Nicholas said. "My wife asked you to assist me, didn't she?" Ludwig asked, squinting because the lizard was too slim to be seen properly by a mole. "She certainly did." "Jolly good. Well, here's the text," Ludwig said, offering the sheet of paper to the hat stand, which did have a slight resemblance to Nicholas. The lizard shuffled over to the mole, took the sheet from his hands and looked at it. Then Mrs. Mole came in, happy to find Nicholas and her Ludwig getting along. She liked companionable animals. "Ludwig, have you written the letter?" she asked. She saw the sheet of paper and yanked it out of the lizard's hands, since she was in a hurry. "Splendid, Ludwig," she called out, skimming through the text before giving Nicholas the letter back. Then she pushed both men through the door into the study and said, "Now the two of you copy this text till we have enough letters, one for every resident of Mousewood. Hurry up, and please, in your best handwriting." Then she closed the door. The lizard and the mole started to write the invitations. 2 days later, a postman came by to pick up the letters and take them to the post office. As a tired Nicholas and an overwrought Ludwig handed him the bundle, he could have sworn both of them had been close friends for years and years. In fact, it had only been 2 days. The following Thursday, the beaver, head of the post office beside the stream, was sorting parcels by address and addressee at his huge sorting desk. The water wheel clattered as the rivulet made its babbling way downstream, when suddenly the post office door opened and the wizard entered. As he crossed the old wooden floor, one couldn't be sure if it was the wood or the old man's bones that were creaking. As usual, the wizard had come to bother the beaver with the same question he'd been asking for weeks. The old man cleared his throat. "Excuse me, Master Beaver, but is there any post for me?" he asked politely. The beaver stared at the wizard in disbelief. For an instant he thought it was just the wizard's strange sense of humour. Then he considered the possibility that the wizard himself could have gone a bit strange due to his incredible age. He looked into the wizard's eyes, wondering how old he might be. "Master Beaver?" the wizard said, not sure if he had already asked for his post or not. Not because he was old and forgetful, but because the beaver hadn't responded. "As I've already told you, we deliver posts directly to your home, and nothing has been forgotten," the beaver reassured him. And if he'd been taller, he might even have patted the old man on the back to comfort him. "There is definitely post for me," the wizard said with conviction. "Haven't we discussed this already?" asked the beaver. Since it was too complicated to explain why he hadn't actually been mistaken, not even the first time, the wizard didn't waste time explaining. But he didn't give in either. "Listen. All the residents of Mousewood have had post in recent days. Each and every one. Only my letter seems to be missing," said the wizard. "I delivered my own post just yesterday," the beaver said, "but I haven't had time to read it yet. You should maybe check your post box thoroughly. You may find your letter." Slowly but surely the wizard was getting impatient. He had already checked his own post box to such a degree he was worried he had overdone it. So the bearded man opened the wooden case he carried on his shoulder and took out his magic wand. In fact, a real wizard doesn't need a wand to cast spells, but by using his wand he could demonstrate to the beaver there was magic involved. Silence and focus were now essential. The wizard waved his wand. Magic sparks zapped through the air, glistening in iridescent colours. The wizard then murmured magic words in a language long forgotten. Roughly translated, it meant, "Watch out! There is magic about to happen, and you never know with magic, so don't complain or anything." Then he pointed the wand into the room, and a short burst of lightning shot out of the tip and, with a sizzle, hit the cupboard on the wall by the sorting desk. This literally breathed life into the cupboard, and it started to lumber towards the wizard and the beaver on short wooden legs. The wizard seemed even more startled than the beaver. Luckily, the march of the furniture came to a halt a moment later. By the wall, where the massive cupboard had until that moment stood, lay a letter on the floor. It must have fallen off the desk. The beaver picked up the envelope and read the address. To the wizard, Mousewood. The old man opened the envelope and skimmed the contents. "Dear friends and neighbours, The Mousewood Art Society is happy to invite you to a very special occasion. Next Thursday, one of Mousewood's great artists will exhibit his paintings to the public for the first time. These works, created over recent years, depict the forest and its residents in the most diverse situations and circumstances. You may even discover yourself in the paintings of this extraordinary artist, and you will certainly see the forest from a new perspective. We look forward to welcoming you next Thursday at Marigold Meadows. Best wishes, the Mousewood Art Society. The wizard gave the letter back to the beaver. The latter pondered a while, since he wasn't sure if he was allowed to read it. After all, it wasn't addressed to him. Deep down, of course, the beaver knew one shouldn't read foreign post. But since this letter was addressed to all residents of Mousewood, and his own letter waited unread at home, and it was okay with the wizard, he read it anyway. "That's today, isn't it?" said the beaver. "Right now, to be precise," replied the wizard. "Can we make it in time?" asked the beaver. The wizard's eyes flashed. They flashed with the same magic that had moved the cupboard, and was now, with a bit of luck and focus, to get them to Marigold Meadows in time. "We can," the wizard said confidently. The beaver and the wizard left the post office, and after the beaver had locked the door, the wizard lifted him onto his shoulders. Then the old man focused intensely, channeling magic powers. He hadn't done that in quite a while, so he wasn't sure if it would work. But then it happened. The wizard was no longer standing on solid ground, but instead floating a good 5 inches above it. The beaver hung on tight to the wizard's collar as the old man accelerated, going faster and faster until he was racing at high speed along the dusty tracks leading to Mousewood, with the beaver still clinging to his shoulder. It was quite a sight. The wizard stood upright and unmoving, yet gliding fast, raising clouds of dust behind him as his white beard fluttered in the wind. As the wizard and the beaver headed towards Mousewood, they flew over a small animal with a bushy auburn tail and beady black eyes as it popped out of the bushes. It was Edward the squirrel. Edward had gone missing a few days previously during a practice session of popping out from behind something. The squirrel had used the time to think about his life, acorns and nuts. Seeing him, the wizard broke his stride, swaying in mid-air like a buoy in a choppy sea. "Edward, what are you still doing here?" the beaver asked the squirrel from the wizard's shoulder. "Why, hello," Edward said. "Have I missed something?" "We're in a hurry," the wizard said, "and you are invited." As he spoke, the old man tapped the wooden case strapped to his right side with his left hand. Edward needed no further explanation. Swiftly he climbed up the wizard's leg, leapt onto the wooden case, and held tight to the leather straps. The wizard went back a few paces, and then took off over the forest track again at high speed. "I don't think this is going to work," shouted Rushlight. He was en route with his old friend Mr. Brown on a cart borrowed from the Badgers. Rushlight was pedalling the bicycle, propelling the cart as hard as he could, but it wasn't moving. "We're running late," Mr. Brown called out, sitting back on the cart holding on to his fedora. "We should probably call for help." "There's no one around for miles," Rushlight said, exhausted. "Then we've got to call some attention to ourselves," Mr. Brown said, and yelled, "Hello? Anybody out there?" There was no answer, but suddenly a strong wind blew up, taking Mr. Brown's hat along in the process and leaving it somewhere up in the branches. The chubby mouse wistfully watched his headpiece disappear. "My apologies," the wind said from some distance away. Then it turned and approached the mice in a wide curve. As it got closer, it took on the shape of an elderly wizard. An elderly wizard floating along with a beaver on his shoulder and a squirrel at his side. At this sight, Mr. Brown put his paw to the spot where his hat had just been. The wizard looked up and hovered straight to the treetops, slowly spinning. He collected Mr. Brown's fedora from between the branches and then descended slowly to the ground. "Here you are," the wizard said, handing Mr. Brown his hat. Much appreciated, Mr. Brown replied. Are you going to the exhibition? He asked, pointing at the wizard's case. One corner of the envelope was poking out, enough to give Mr. Brown a clue as to where they were heading. Indeed we are. You, however, seem to be suffering some difficulties and are now worried you may be late, I assume, the wizard said, pointing to the cart stuck in the muddy forest earth. Stuck deep enough to tell the wizard Mr. Brown and Rushlight needed help. Unlike Mr. Brown, the wizard usually needed more than just one clue to solve problems the classical way, in other words, without magic. In this case, though, he was right first time. Your assumption is correct, Mr. Brown answered. Well, you're welcome to travel with us, the wizard offered. We still have some room. He lifted Mr. Brown onto his right shoulder and helped Rushlight to climb up the wooden case. The brawny mouse greeted Edward with a firm handshake. Name's Rushlight, he said. Good day, replied Edward. The wizard accelerated again, and together with the post office beaver, Edward, Mr. Brown, and Rushlight, he floated on to Marigold Meadows. There are so many animals in Mousewood that a mighty wizard wanting to attend an exhibition has to expect to give some of them a lift. A great many animals had already gathered at Marigold Meadows, excitedly waiting for the Art Society exhibition. On the grass stood dozens of easels, still covered in white linen to make the grand opening even more exciting. Dressed in an elegant black suit, Mr. Ludwig Mole nervously checked his pocket watch. Only a few more minutes until he was supposed to hold the opening speech. It was only a few lines long, but he had practiced it several times nonetheless. With a speech only a couple of lines long, it would be especially embarrassing to fluff or forget something. Ludwig looked around, somewhat disoriented. Nicholas? He asked, tapping the shoulder of a guest next to him. This was in fact Plato the Frog, who at least resembled Nicholas in terms of colour. To Ludwig, Plato, however, was an amorphous shade, while Nicholas was more of a blurred, slender line. Yes, said Plato. The frog was just talking to Jonas the otter about a song he'd heard recently. Oh, you're not Nicholas, no, Ludwig concluded in confusion. He's right over there, Jonas said. Nicholas, he shouted, beckoning to his fellow musician. The lizard walked over. Jonas pointed to the mole and then continued his conversation with Plato. Showtime, I think, Nicholas asked his friend Ludwig. Ah, there you are. Yes, we're about to start, Ludwig replied, calmly, now that his good friend was there. Break a leg, Nicholas said, slapping the mole on the back. Ludwig took a deep breath and started walking through the audience. On the way, he accidentally bumped into one of the wood dwarves, who was talking to Peter the badger and his wife. Oi, watch it, said Logger the wood dwarf. I'm sure it was an accident, said the badger lady, trying to calm him down. Accident? Pah! Commented Steinberg. Ludwig was far too busy to notice what was going on around him. He eventually reached the podium and took off his glasses, polishing them with a handkerchief. Then he gave the audience time to quieten down and prepare for the speech. Soon the animals and a wood sprite fell silent in anticipation. Ludwig's wife was in the front row, quietly applauding to reassure her husband. Dear guests, it is a great pleasure to welcome all of you tonight here at Marigold Meadows, Ludwig began, but was immediately interrupted by the muffled boom of approaching thunder. The guests turned in the direction the sound was coming from. In a cloud of dust and leaves, the wizard appeared from the forest, coming to an abrupt landing right in front of the astonished visitors. As the dust settled, he set down the beaver, Mr. Brown, Rushlight, and Edward the squirrel. At once Edward ran to his friends Oswald and Edgar, who had arrived half an hour before. The others joined the animals in the audience, and, as the excitement wore off, Ludwig continued. The Mousewood Art Society proudly and for the first time presents the work of an artist, a resident of Mousewood like all of us here. His paintings, completed over recent years, depict the forest from various points of view, and of course the perspective of the artist himself. Ladies and gentlemen, I declare the exhibition open. The first story of Mice, Squirrels, and Mousewood.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed that. I certainly did. If you watched it to the very end, you probably did, or at least enjoyed it to some degree, so I'm glad. I hope you guys have a good day, and I will see you in the next video. Have a lovely day.